The tempter's name was Vanity, and my wife succumbed too easily to his charm. All her life, Heather was pretty, but a little overweight. So when the children grew up and left home, she began to exercise. At first, it was just to kill time. Then everything changed dramatically. The more she trained, the slimmer her body became. Her body became her obsession, and she was born again as a goddess. Then the flirting began. For the first 22 years of our marriage, we were a friendly and loving couple. We went to social events together. We danced together at parties. Now, this difference between my sexually attractive wife and her out-of-shape, middle-aged husband has led us to go in different directions. Heather had her choice of attractive men. It was never just one guy. She talked and danced with all of them. At the same time, she rarely graced her former friends with her presence. My friends went from insulting me to looking at me sympathetically. But seriously, what could I do? Her behavior was not clearly wrong. She could dance with guys who were younger, fitter, and more attractive than me. But there was no real romance. She just looked like she was having fun. Needless to say, she was happier than I ever remembered. I was ready to wait it out. I've heard about the midlife crisis, and I hoped that this too would pass soon. However, it eventually became clear that Heather's newfound sense of power had changed her fundamentally. Narcissism came first. Heather couldn't stop looking at herself and playing with her body. Then came the conceit. She was a trophy now, and she knew it. She simply radiated, "I can conquer any man." Despite the serious disrespect it showed towards me, the other wives hated her. Heather didn't even bother to notice. Heather's sudden, dramatic derailment was easy to understand. One minute, she was an ordinary American housewife. Next, she became the object of desire for a crowd of alpha males. The radical shift from housewife to goddess of love could distort anyone's perception of themselves in relation to the world. However, this new reality began to influence her decision-making, and this invited the serpent to paradise. She appeared downstairs one fateful Friday morning. I enjoyed my bagel breakfast. Her hair was disheveled, and she was wearing her tattered old robe. She took a cup of coffee and sat down opposite me. I recognized the stubborn look. I thought, "Ooh, this doesn't bode well," she said. "Tom, I need to talk to you." These words are not what the husband wants to hear. So I put the bagel aside and looked attentive. She said, "I never had my own identity. I've always been Tommy Jor, and Susie's mom and your wife. But now I have changed myself. I am my own woman." She paused and waited for the obvious question. I said, "What does that even mean?" She said, "When we met, I was a gray mouse. I had boyfriends, but I was just mediocre. In fact, I think it was our mutual lack of personal charm that made us so compatible, and we have lived a completely unnoticed life for the past 22 years. She stood up and opened her robe. She was naked underneath. Her toned thighs, toned sides, firm stomach, and large, firm breasts were outstanding. She ran her hands over her magnificent body and said proudly, "I am no longer a gray mouse." Then she closed her robe and sat down again. She looked at me as if she wanted me to understand. She said, "I get harassed by men all the time. I ignore them because I love you. But one special man offered to take me to an unusual place." She paused, lowered her head, and added in a whisper, "And God forgive me, but I'm going to take him up on his offer." I already guessed where this conversation was going, and I was angry. But I controlled my anger and said, "What does that mean?" She looked at me with pleading eyes and said, "You don't know him. We met at a club. And since then, we've met at dinners several times. During that time, he behaved like a perfect gentleman." I said bitterly, "That means he hasn't tried to get you into bed yet." She looked indignant and said, "No need to be rude. He's not. He's older, very rich, and worldly. He only wants my company." I looked incredulous, so she quickly added, "He asked me to accompany him to Paris next week, and I'm going to go with him. It'll only be one time. He's married." I said, "Let me get this straight. You know he's married. And maybe you should remember that you're married too. Isn't this a textbook definition of cheating?" She looked annoyed and said, "That's not true. I will only be with him this once. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. After this, I will belong only to you forever, and I will make it up to you. You will see," she added sincerely. "But I need one unusual memory for my album before time takes it from me." And she again pointed to her body. Her tone told me she was obsessed with aging. I said, "That's bullshit, Heather. This guy is not a gentleman, and what he's proposing is not romantic. All he wants is to get you into bed." I stopped and added, trying to sound more determined than I felt, "Because I won't be here when you get back." She looked contemptuously and said, "Don't say that, Tom. Do you love me? I know you love me, and you'll let me do it because we love each other. It doesn't mean I'm sneaking around behind your back. I have one dreamy fling, and you will never regret it." She was wrong. I already regretted it. I took her left hand with both of mine and meaningfully played with her wedding ring. I said sincerely, "I love you. If you count the courtship, we lived together for 24 fantastic years, and we have 2 wonderful children. So all I can do is beg you, please don't do this." She looked sad and said, "I will always love you, Tom, and we're going to grow old together, spoiling our grandchildren. But on Monday, I'm leaving for Paris." It struck me with a lightning bolt of pure anguish. I asked pleadingly, "Is there any way I can talk you out of this?" She looked at me patronizingly, the way a mother might give to a naive child, and said decisively, "This is definitely going to happen. All preparations have already been made." I stood up without another word and walked out the front door. She called Tom. It was the same whiny tone teenagers use when their parents are being unreasonable. I kept walking. I went to the county park. I'm not a crybaby, but my stomach was doing flip-flops. I opened the car door and left the bagel in the parking lot. I wiped my mouth and sat down, looking at the same green lawn that I had seen my children play on centuries ago. You never think this will happen to you, so you never have a plan. I thought about my situation. I had nowhere to go. Where would I stay? I make decent money. But with 2 kids in college and an upper-middle-class lifestyle, we can barely cope. We had very little savings and our credit cards were almost maxed out. I have no family or close friends. In short, either stay home or sleep in the car. Heather knew our financial situation. I think that was one of the reasons why she was so confident that she could pull off this little trick. Hopelessness, alienation, and a feeling of extreme loneliness hit me like a cloud of mustard gas. I said to myself, I have invested my emotional life in this woman, and now she's holding me for ransom. This realization brought me back from the brink and strengthened my spine. I am not the kind of person who will gracefully accept the role of victim, and I am decisive in my business dealings. So if Heather could make unilateral decisions, then so could I. But first I wanted to get free legal advice. I called Jim Edgerton. He is a friend and lawyer. I said, "Jim, Tommy Meissner is here." There was a short pause. He asked, "How are you, Tom?" I laughed and said, "I was calling to see if you knew a good lawyer," he said. "Need divorce advice?" It was a statement, not a question. I said, "It looks like you expected it." Jim said, "Unfortunately, yes. Heather was seen in town with Charlie Wilkins. Do you know him?" Of course I knew him. Everyone in town knew him. He was the CEO of a major employer in the area. He was 60, a tall, distinguished man, a pillar of society, and a notoriously dirty old man. His wife was Maeve Wilkins. Her blessing has created your reputation, and her disapproval turned you into a social outcast. I thought to myself, Heather, what have you gotten yourself into? When I came home, the house was empty. Heather was either at the club or out to lunch. I assumed it was still just lunch. Wilkins was too conspicuous for daytime fun. This was the whole point of the trip to Paris. She has already started to get ready. Nightgowns and sexy lingerie were a revelation. I've never seen anything like this before. This cemented the reality. I had to sit down for a second. I was pretending to be reading a book when she came in. She looked stunning in her fashionable sportswear. I'd probably look this good too if corporate America didn't keep me tied to a desk 40 hours a week. She walked towards the stairs, humming a cheerful tune. Then she saw me. She looked delighted. She came up to me and said, "Let me take a shower and you can join me." It was obvious that her engine was running. I looked up as if she had interrupted me and said, "I'd love to, but I'm at the most exciting part of this novel, so I'm afraid I'll have to decline." She understood. She said, "Don't be so moody, it's still yours." Her body was amazing in her tight workout clothes. I looked at her with what I hoped was neutral interest and said, "Seriously, I'll refuse." She was angry for a second and maybe a little offended. Then a look of determination appeared on her face. She said, "Okay, act like that. It won't change anything." And she stamped her foot up the stairs. The weekend was painful. Heather continued to pretend that the next week wasn't a big deal, and she treated me like a naughty boy trying to ruin her fun. Even worse, she acted as if her affair wouldn't change anything. I avoided this deceiver as much as I could. She literally became a different person, and this man was without a soul. She tried to give me pity sex. She even took out a few items that she had left for Dictic. It didn't have any effect on me. I justified my strange lack of feeling as the consequences of shock. The situation was unimaginable, and it will take me a while to realize the reality of this. Then I will feel pain. Pride is a deadly sin. Heather knew her body was great, but it also had an expiration date. So in her version of the fairy tale, a prince on a white horse would whisk her away for a romantic Holy Week. This was to prove once and for all that she was the most beautiful in the country. Then she could triumphantly return to her husband, feeling validated. And of course, my state of mind was not part of her narrative. Heather's narcissistic behavior may have been caused by her children leaving home. An empty nest means the end of an era for a woman, especially for such a devoted mother as she was. Perhaps she took stock of her life and felt it was her turn. Or maybe she was just crazy. Whatever the reason, the Heather I loved would never have been so selfishly cruel. Her hazy perception of reality wasn't the worst thing. She sincerely believed that I would accept her little misunderstanding, and that we will immediately move on to normal life because we love each other. In this, she was fundamentally mistaken. Plain and simple, I cannot love a woman who believes that cheating is an integral part of her personal growth. Heather tried to talk about it Sunday night. I think she just wanted to convince me of her ideas before flying off. But I've reached the limit of talking. I said, "There's no excuse for what you do." I looked at her closely and asked, "Do you realize how completely unlike you this is, and how radically life-changing this step is for both of us? You're ruining 22 years of marriage, 2 kids, and a happy home for 1 week of flirting." She looked at me as if I was being unreasonably cruel. Then she said with tenderness in her voice, "You don't really think so. Your male ego is just a little bruised, but you will get over it. When I return, I will make you the happiest man on earth. You will see. This beautiful body will be everything yours, and I will love you even more for allowing me to do this." Ugh, talk about complacency. I'm not the kind of person whose first thought is violence, but I could contact the guys who killed the wife and her lover. On the big day, I was sitting at breakfast drinking coffee. Heather came downstairs very excited. I didn't say a word. She was dressed to kill. She wore a modest skirt and 3-inch heels for the trip, but she put her magnificent breasts on display in a low-cut silk blouse with a light jacket on top. The cleavage was amazing. She came up to me. It looked like she was planning a passionate farewell. It would fit her narrative. This was the part of the story where the admiring husband rejoices that his beautiful wife is going off to sow her wild oats, and he gives her a loving kiss goodbye. I didn't even get up, so she had to settle for a kiss on the cheek. Her obvious annoyance at my game-ruining behavior was clear to see. At that moment, a beep sounded. She looked excited and exclaimed, "He's here." At least she had the decency to keep the bastard out of the house. She grabbed her suitcase and hurried out of the open front door. I went over to close it. She just arrived at the limousine. He waited there, looking handsome, tall and distinguished. She placed both hands on his chest and stood on her tiptoes to kiss him. It sounded like an affectionate greeting a woman might give to her longtime husband. Except her husband was standing in the doorway behind her. Wilkins looked up at me. Then his eyes narrowed. He's done this before many times, and this amused him. Heather turned around and waved as she got into the car. I didn't wave back. Instead, I closed the door on 22 years of marriage. This was not without significant pain. As they say today, was the first day of the rest of my life, which was complete nonsense. As far as I was concerned, the road ahead ended only in a wasteland of betrayed expectations. However, strangely, I was able to work effectively. The part of me that wasn't invested in Heather was dedicated to my work, and it was calming to immerse myself in the familiar rhythms of a normal workday. I made a conscious decision to push Heather out of my thoughts, which was successful right up until she sent me a light-hearted message saying they were on their way safely. It was a startling indication of how out of touch she was. I was afraid that she would keep sending me photos, so I went to my local Apple dealer and bought myself a new phone. The old me ran over to the parking lot when I left. Then I looked through local housing listings to find a place I could move into immediately. In the long run, I was probably doomed to bankruptcy, but in the short term, I had plenty of cash. This is because I make a lot of money, and I decided to stop paying for everything that was associated with my old life. As the song says, freedom's just another word for having nothing. In fact, I felt so liberated that I invested in a double wide. You can keep all your trailer park jokes to yourself. My new place was close to work. It had great parking, a nice deck, and was 3 times the size of any apartment I'd looked at. The furniture was completely new, if a little tacky, and my neighbors were pensioners, not bikers, so it was quiet here, like a cemetery in a sense, literally, if you know what I mean. On Tuesday, I moved all my portable belongings to my new home. My last night in our McMansion was terrible. All the ghosts and memories of happy days passed before me in my sleep. The pain was excruciating. Then, in the morning, I threw off my marital shackles and was born again just like my treacherous wife. The following Monday, the front page of the Tribune published an article under the loud headline, "Games in Paris." There was even a photo of the 2 adulterers looking dumbfounded as they went through customs. The dirty details were smeared throughout the 3-day news cycle. The coverage included many rumors and speculation about Wilkins' other alleged affairs. It all made for a fascinating read, and it even received some national coverage. I don't know what Wilkins thought was going to happen. Maybe he just assumed that I would be proud and cuckolded, or perhaps he thought he was too powerful to be affected by it. Either way, he had a lot to learn about the cost of pride. He forgot about the caught atmosphere that permeates the Fourth Estate. The media is out for blood, and there's nothing like a juicy scandal to sell newspapers. So I used Wilkins' public position to unleash the hounds of the press. It only took a couple of phone calls and a few simple facts. I don't run in Charlie and Heather circles, so I don't know the exact details. Wilkins remained married, but as the tabloid said, I heard that his wife took a lover. I definitely knew that Wilkins' board of directors had promptly retired him. He became an awkward presence as a leader. There was the usual golden handshake, and Charlie Wilkins was relegated to the ranks of the idle rich. I had mixed feelings. His career was ruined. I caused it. But the guy still had enough money to travel to Paris. Heather started calling me at the start of the workday on Tuesday. She must have tried to call me on Monday, but that phone had tire tracks. I knew that sooner or later I would have to talk to her. So I gathered my strength and answered. I said in my most business-like tone, "Tommy Maisner, how can I help you?" Her anger could barely be contained. She said, "Where were you? I called all day yesterday and you didn't answer the phone." I said in a conversational tone, "How was Paris? You looked really good in the photos." She said furiously, "Where are you? Where are your things? Why aren't you at home?" I laughed cheerfully and said, "What part of I won't be here when you get back didn't you understand?" There was a long pause. She said somewhat softly, "I didn't think you were serious. There's no chance you'd just walk away after 22 years of happy marriage. I laughed and said, "Oh, but I'm gone, Heather, and I now have a whole new life. And best of all, it's completely without you." There was an even longer pause. Her tone became seductive. "But my love, I can't live without you. You know that." She probably didn't realize how true her words were. I kept what was left in my bank accounts and savings. After I paid for my move, this money will only last a couple of weeks, and she had nothing to replenish them. I said in a matter-of-fact tone, "You'll have to get used to it, Heather. I'm completely out of your life. Now I really need to get back to work." She exclaimed, "Wait, don't hang up. Do I really need to talk to you?" All her self-confidence was gone. She sounded desperate. I wanted to complete this. I said, "Let's meet at Johnny's and we can discuss the terms of the division." She said pleadingly, "Can you come here? I'll cook dinner." I said darkly, "I will never set foot in that house again, especially with you in it." She said uncertainty. "Okay, Johnny's." "What time?" I said. 7 o'clock. This gave me some time to prepare for the upcoming test. And Heather did not disappoint. All conversation stopped when she walked through the door. Johnny's is a local diner. The appearance of a goddess like her among them made the locals stare. She truly was a magnificent woman. She showed off her long, muscular legs in a very tight little black dress. The dress ended 4 inches above the knees. She had a sweet but plain face. However, with all the beauties she has mastered over the past year, she could turn into a movie actress. Of course, there was also her full and amazingly firm body. When she burned fat after giving birth, she discovered that she had a long and slender waist. The contrast with her super-toned sides and bulging butt made her appear even curvier than she actually was. Hate is not the opposite of love. Hatred involves feelings towards another person. Lack of love is complete indifference. That's exactly what I felt when she approached the table. She showed me only clear disrespect, and her protective attitude before she left rendered any residual feelings invalid. Now all I felt was the desire to end this unpleasant matter. She even tried to sit in the booth next to me. I said, "Heather, we can't talk sitting side by side, and we have some serious issues that we need to resolve." She looked at me as if I didn't understand what I was missing and sat down opposite me. It was clear that she still thought she held all the cards. I said, to be polite, "How are you?" She was going to tell me about her trip. I saw it in her eyes. What she saw in my eyes made her change her mind. Instead, she said, as if trying to convince me, "Stop sulking, baby, and go home to the woman who loves you. I told you you wouldn't regret it, and I'll try hard to make it up to you." She still didn't understand. I have known this woman in sickness and in health, in the boring daily routine of home and in the heat of passion, and I loved her for 22 long years without looking back. Now I have nothing left. She destroyed all my confidence. I believed in her. I believed in our marriage. I believed that she loved me. And what did I get in return? Babu, who thought that her gorgeous body was the solution to all problems. I said, "You'll just have to accept that I'll never come back. So we need to agree on the terms of the division." She looked skeptical and said, "It's funny. We might have had a little misunderstanding, but that's all over now. I'm yours and yours alone, and I'll be yours forever." Who is she? I couldn't hide my bewilderment as I said, "You call a week of sex a misunderstanding. It was a carefully planned and brazen act of betrayal. The Heather I knew was loving and kind. She would never do something like that." I looked at her seriously and said in my most neutral tone, "As far as I care, the Heather I married no longer exists. You killed her. And the selfish, vain, manipulative bitch who replaced you is not the object of my love." Interests. Her face expressed shock and disbelief. It probably looked the same as mine when she told me about her Paris adventure. She seemed truly confused. I deviated from the script. We were supposed to live happily ever after. This happens in all fairy tales. She said, "Look at me. I'm the same one you married, only much improved. Didn't you like the new body I created for you?" I said, "I loved it until you willingly gave it to someone else. You slept with Wilkins last week, didn't you? She was going to tell me that it didn't matter, that it was just sex, and that she loves me and only me. But she must have had some common sense left in her because she just looked at me with confusion and guilt. I said tiredly, "It doesn't really matter. Now you can have sex with whoever you want. I don't have any rights over you anymore. I just need to settle our accounts. Then we can go our separate ways." She looked shocked. It seemed like she was just beginning to realize that I was really serious. She said quickly and with real emotion, "I've been faithful to you for 22 years, and I will be faithful for the rest of my life. How can 1 week change that?" Marvelous. Not a word of apology, not a drop of remorse. "Heather, I barely recognize you." Now it was my turn to be patronizing. I said, "Really? You agreed to be another man's fuck toy for an entire week, and you thought I would just wipe the slate clean?" The conversation was becoming meaningless. She simply did not understand. I said, "Listen, Heather, I really have to go. You're going to need money to live on. This is how it's going to work out. I'm going to ask Jim Edgerton to give you the fairest separation agreement we can come up with. I owe you the first 22 years. I added, "All the details will be laid out in the agreement. We'll split everything equally. The kids may have to take out student loans to finish their studies, and you'll have to moderate your demands. But I'm sure you can live on what I give you, until you find a job." Unfortunately, this offer did not include gym memberships. I looked at her to make sure she was paying attention. I said, "The more important thing is that we will have to sell the house and split the profit from the sale. Neither of us can afford to live there. But fortunately, we have a lot of capital, so we can sell it at a very low price, and I already have a buyer. This will help us both avoid bankruptcy." It was starting to dawn on her. At first it was bewilderment and then panic. She looked like she was about to cry as she said, "This can't be true. How could you just leave after so many happy years together? What should I do now?" I said, "You're a beautiful woman, Heather. I'll give you the fastest divorce I can. You'll have your choice of men, and I know it won't be long before you find your next fool." I wanted her to quickly leave my books and move on to someone else's fast. She pulled herself together and said, "You're talking about this like a business deal. I give a man my body and he takes care of me. Is that what you're offering? Does it sound like I'm selling my body?" I said, "You've been there and done that. What is Paris after all? You can call it romance, but I call it selling. So if the shoe fits, put it on." I woke up. She stood up with me. She looked at me with pleading eyes, and she said with true desire in her voice, "Come home, Tommy. I miss our happy life together." It was more like the Heather I once knew, and I almost gave up. But I remembered what the new and improved version was. So instead I said, "Tomorrow you will receive the documents." And I left her life. The divorce was as calm as the picturesque coast of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944. There were no actual losses in lives, but Heather's pet berserker, who was personally paid for by Wilkins, did everything he could to rob and ruin in court. Heather finally realized that her gold mine had hit a mine, and she was absolutely desperate to get as much out of me as she could. For my part, my friend Jim was an extremely competent advocate, and my offer was very generous, given that there was a highly publicized trip to Paris hanging over it all. As for me, there was no love for Heather, just a hot pile of nothing. And nothing is exactly what I felt nothing. I didn't want to bury her in the backyard. It would give her too much of what the Japanese call face. Instead, I just wanted to get this bitch out of my life. I once loved her. But whoever inhabited her body now was not the object of my love interests. We were in a state that stylized itself as no guilty. But judges have their discretion, and it was quite clear that the judge who tried our case hated Wilkins, perhaps as long as I have. Maybe the respected magistrate lost to the idiot at golf, or maybe Wilkins slept with his wife. In any case, every decision of the judge was in our favor. As a result, Heather received the exact same amount of child support that I originally offered. The fact that we sold the house made things easier, and probably kept us both out of Chapter 7. I had a dark thought that I had finally gotten something out of my 22 years with this bitch. The capital covered all our unsecured debts and left us with $30,000 in our pockets. I thought this would last Heather about 3 months at her current expenses. Then she will have to join the rest of us peasants in this boring and gray world called reality. Tommy Jr. and Susie attended Marquette. Tommy was in his last year, and Susie was in her second to last year. They were both provided for by our educational savings trust. So the $30,000 I received from the sale of the house, along with some modest federal grants, guaranteed their completion of their studies. Heather got to them first and put the case in her favor. As a result, both of them were unhappy with me. However, they were good kids, and I knew they would come around eventually. We separated after the court decision, not without a little sadness on my part. I felt a natural sense of loss, thinking about what once was and what would never be again. Heather and I were once very close. Still, I wasn't about to waste another neuron trying to figure out why my life had changed so radically. The answer was obvious. Each of us is fighting a lifelong battle with fleeting time. I am human. I'm getting older, and I understand the inevitable feeling that life is passing me by. Heather felt insecure about aging. She drove her better angels to extinction, and the inevitable result was our mutual destruction. I also knew Heather, and I'm sure she would have stayed on this side of the border if Wilkins hadn't gone to great lengths to lure her across it. Any former gray mouse would have a hard time saying no when being courted so actively by a man like him, especially when she compares the rich, tanned, and graceful to the middle-aged, pale, and scruffy. So, in my opinion, Charlie Wilkins has a lot to pay for. All of Heather's other excuses were just that, an excuse to scratch an itch. Heather has turned herself into a true object of lust. She would be an obvious target for any man who lacks moral principles, personal integrity, and a sense of honor. The fact that she gave in so easily told me everything I needed to know about her and the state of our marriage, so I left without any remorse. But loneliness was still an insidious condition. Heather got married as soon as the divorce was finalized. This was what I expected. She really had no other way to support herself. There was a 23-year difference between them. She was 2 years younger than me, 42. Her new husband, old Bud, was 65, but cut from the same mold as Charlie Wilkins. Perhaps Heather had daddy issues. Her new husband was a figure in the local political scene, currently held our district's congressional seat. He was also a friend of Wilkins. I learned from local gossip that old Bud had a reputation for classic political corruption. Heather probably didn't care. She had her own sugar daddy and was often in the news standing next to him looking like a trophy wife. I almost threw up. It was not because I had any residual feelings for the boat. It was just such an extreme example of the destructive influence of selfishness. My only consolation was the forced smile and look of absolute despair in her eyes during television interviews. It was the beaten look of a bullied pet. It was nice to think that there might be trouble in paradise. She had made her own bed, and it was satisfying to think that she would be forced to spend the rest of her life lying in it. Perhaps Wilkins and his buddy traded it, as old Charlie certainly didn't get it at home anymore. Or perhaps her new husband used her favors as political capital. She may even have had some genuine regrets. Thinking about it was the gift that kept on giving. Heather's marriage freed me from the obligations imposed by the court, and I never lacked a social life. Any 44-year-old husband chin who still looks decent, not married, is outnumbered by women in his age group by a ratio of 3 to 1. That's because all the men of the right age are busy sleeping with 20-year-old beauties. So I had my choice of beautiful, elegant, and, might I add, sexually experienced older ladies. The problem is that all my long-term plans and assumptions were shattered, and I was simply drifting. The life of the average man must follow the same worn path. Get a good education, meet the girl of your dreams, find a satisfying job, work hard, have children, and die in each other's arms. All I had now was work. I met Heather Smith my senior year at Michigan. I swam for them while getting my computer engineering degree. computer engineering is not the 4-year technology vacation that athletes typically pursue. And since I needed to swim to keep my scholarship, I had no time for socialization. But Heather was on the women's team, and we crossed paths often. This was before Speedo and Tier took over the sports swimwear market, and the super thin nylon suits we wore hugged the body in interesting ways. If you're a guy, the first thing you do when you get out of the water is pull on the front of your suit. Otherwise, the public will get a good idea of what you have there and whether it is cropped. The same applies to women. Therefore, if we had a joint training session with the women's team, most of us guys either stayed in the water or did not take off our tracksuits, because walking around the pool deck in an excited state can be very embarrassing. So I was in my usual position, holding the float, when Heather stepped onto the starting block. I've never seen her before, but she amazed me. She was of average height, perhaps a little plump, but she had large breasts and legs that could crush a man. Her face wasn't pretty, but the smile she gave her trainer was pure sunshine. I fell in love. She was also my type fast in the distance, so the university PR people wanted to take a picture of us together for the cover of their program, and so we started talking. The rest is history. I asked her out for coffee, which led to a date, which led to her showing me what a really strong woman can be in bed. The first time we had sex was in my college room. My neighbor was away for the weekend, and I managed to sneak her past the trainer who sometimes patrolled the hallways. She was dressed in what was then considered college chic. I remember this style was called grunge. This style was a real treat for the male students because all those baggy clothes were easy to take off. I already knew everything about her body. In those days, it was impossible for female swimmers to maintain much modesty due to tight swimsuits. We lay there, catching our breath, for more than a couple of seconds. Remember, we were both more physically fit than 99.9% of the world's population, and we still nearly blew each other's vascular systems. She looked at me in surprise and said, "I've been with several men, but I've never had sex like this." We became inseparable after that. I graduated from university and got my master's in engineering while she was finishing her degree in education. I had a small off-campus apartment and Heather moved in with me. We were never apart except when she was on guest appearances. We got married as soon as she graduated and we moved to Chicago. I was hired almost immediately by one of the 4 major accounting firms. We bought a small house in need of renovation in Oak Park, and I drove the L to work every day. Heather taught at Bishop Fenwick. We lived an idyllic life as a childless couple for 25 years until Tommy Jr. was born and Heather became a full-time housewife. Without her income, we struggled to make ends meet, but we pulled it together. Heather was the best mom in the world, and I was proud of her. She was just starting to think about going back to class when little Susie was born. It was a little unexpected, but we loved her too, and Heather returned to full-time mothering. The thought that my wife would return to teaching did not even arise. By the time Susie started school, I had become the head of the firm's security practice, so there was nothing much to be desired. Heather was completely devoted to me and our children, and so time passed in a golden glow. The kids grew up, and we moved several times, eventually ending up in a small town in Virginia, south of Washington. This city was ideal for me, both for trips to Washington and Richmond. I could drive to Richmond in 55 minutes, and the 45-minute drive on I-95 to the Springfield subway station was relatively stress-free compared to driving all the way to the rat's nest of traffic around D.C. Finally, we had personal freedom and could do what we always wanted, just Heather and me. I thought we had the perfect life until Wilkins invaded her. I don't make excuses for her, but she spent almost 21 years as a stay-at-home mom. She did it without complaint. But during that time, she went from being the archetypal female athlete to being a plump, out-of-shape housewife. At the same time, I was becoming more and more successful, and perhaps a little too absent from home. It was something of a perfect storm. There must have been a lot of hidden resentment building up inside her, because her betrayal came like a bolt from the blue and was very difficult to accept. Whatever the reason, my life story ended long before the dying in each other's arms part. It was a fact. Unfortunately, it also left me with an empty feeling that I had wasted my presence on this earth. I knew this was a weak and childish thought. But given my situation, I couldn't get rid of this thought. I was almost 46 years old. I had a great job. I was a junior partner at the firm and led the cybersecurity practice in Richmond. I also had a lot of free money thanks to Heather leaving my life. Moreover, I had to spend time in bars to have sex. Women themselves were drawn to me without any obligations. As I said, men's passion for the hard bodies of 20-year-old beauties is the main reason for extreme horniness among middle-aged women. So I had a choice of beautiful, elegant, and, might I add, sexually experienced older ladies. A year after my divorce, I bought a small place on the banks of the Rappahannock River in Capitol Bay. It was just a one-room hut with a tin roof, but it was so peaceful there on this big, lazy river. The scenery and wildlife could keep you entertained for hours. I had a Manatee 10 single kayak that I used to paddle around various bays and lagoons, take artistic photos of the abundant flora and fauna of the Virginia River Valley, and just enjoy the gorgeous summer. It was always humid at night, and my window air conditioner struggled to cope. So I pulled out the kayak and paddled out into the twilight, amid the croaking of frogs and the noise of insects. I floated along, letting the current carry me south toward Tappahannock and the Downing Bridge. I had 3 bottles of a Slin orange starfish in the kayak's built-in cooler. I put my feet up on the side, sat back, and thought about the stars. I sailed under the full moon on that hot, humid, peaceful night. And that's when I started to come to my senses. For a change, I was drifting physically rather than emotionally. Maybe that's what caused it. But the answer suddenly appeared fully formed in my head. Move or die. This might sound completely melodramatic, but I wanted to regain my self-respect. So I knew I had to stop being a coward and take a chance. It was a scary undertaking for a 45-year-old man to leave a comfortable life and start all over again. Middle-aged men do not have the energy and naivety of young men. But the only other alternative was to continue wandering in the desert without a plan, and that seemed so cowardly. I swam almost a mile, and it was already close to midnight. The stars sparkled as always, and the moon became even brighter. I could hear the sounds of warmth from the cicadas on my side of the river, and at that moment the details of what I was about to do began to pour into my brain like coal from a chute. It was supposed to start on Monday. Rowing back was not as easy as going with the current, but I was in great shape, and by 2 a.m. I was hauling my kayak to shore. I got into my Land Rover and drove back to the trailer park. I still smile when I talk about it. I took a couple of hours nap, put on my business suit, and headed to our headquarters in Washington. I wanted to talk to the managing partner. On the way back up the river last night, I was contemplating the details of a complete reset. I clearly had to adopt a new strategy for my life. This was obvious because the old paradigm did not work so well. In fact, if you think about it, the American dream is a depletion of the soul. You are subject to a tired set of social rules. Keep your wife and kids happy and make your boss happy. Of course, all these things are in the interests of others. So what happens when you start pleasing only yourself? Your wife starts cheating, your kids think you're a jerk, and your friends turn on you. Oh yes, that's right, I forgot. I played by all the traditional rules for 22 years, and guess what? My wife cheated, my kids think I'm a jerk, and I have no friends. Even work, which was the place where I continued to be successful, happy, and fulfilled, was starting to look like a long road to a dead-end ending, one where I ended up with nothing. Moreover, I was already living in a mobile home. It was simply in the wrong place, a place I had to leave if I wanted a fresh start. Last night my epiphany, and it fell on me like Paul on the road to Damascus, showed me all of this. So accordingly, I was going to shuffle the cards. Basically, I planned to go wild, and that's what I wanted to talk to the managing partner about. Our main office was on New York Avenue, between 11th and 12th Streets. This, not coincidentally, made it convenient to K Street. The building created an irreplaceable impression of wealth and success, which was necessary to attract major Washington power players. So the managing partner sat in a throne room slightly larger and richer than the Taj Mahal. As one of the junior partners, I could arrange a meeting, but it was obvious that he didn't even know who I was. I expected to hear Purcell's trumpet freestyle as I walked the 50 feet from the door to his desk. The partner stood up and shook my hand. He pointed me to a place and said, "How can I help you?" Thomas? Nobody called me that except my mother. I've thought this through carefully. Basically, I was going to suggest doing penetration testing in the wild. We have already provided this service, but those pen tests were the home variety, which didn't really tell you anything. What I was about to suggest was a rough version of sex without safe words. This will be an aggressive attack on the target system, and this is exactly what is required to ensure that the client is truly protected. The managing partner, naturally, was horrified. He paused and said, "This is ridiculous. What would happen if we actually damaged or disabled one of their systems?" I said. "Wouldn't they like to know about it through us, rather than get the news in the middle of the night thanks to the Chinese or North Koreans? And we would know how to quickly restore them, since we were the ones who took them out." He sat back for a second and seemed interested. I added enthusiastically, "Yes, this could be potentially damaging, and the last thing you would want is to associate our firm's good name with a black operation against one of our clients, even if it would be in their own interests." He nodded vigorously in agreement. "Fine," I continued. "So I propose to separate myself completely from the firm, to actually go into the shadows. I will set up somewhere very far away from all of you, and I will conduct all my transactions as if they were not part of the firm's business. Of course, you will continue to pay me, but it will be through a fictitious corporation to give you the opportunity to deny your involvement." He continued to look skeptical, so I added, "We won't have many clients, but some of the more enlightened ones will be willing to take a chance. This will cover my salary. Otherwise, I will retire on my own, and you will lose a very profitable niche. I know I can sell it, so I'm willing to take the risk." He leaned back in his chair, clasped his fingers, and thought. He then said, "Okay, you've convinced me, at least enough to discuss it with the other senior partners. I'll let you know tomorrow." I stood up and thanked him. We shook hands, and I walked out into my new life. The next day, I called the managing partner. He said, "Thomas, we've been talking about this all night, and most of the board thinks your idea is bold and entrepreneurial. So we'll support you. We need details of what you're planning. Send them to Art Reynolds ASAP and keep me posted. I'm interested, and good luck." Art was the personal business partner of the managing partner. If he was given this task, it means they were more interested in my idea than they let on. Since the divorce was finalized, I have accumulated a decent amount of cash reserves. The trailer didn't cost much, but it was fully paid off, so I sold it for a little more. I bought my river cabin with cash. In fact, it was so cheap that I was never sure the seller actually owned it, so I could walk out of there and not look back. When I set out, I had 6 figures in my pocket. All my earthly belongings were crammed into my Land Rover LR4. I had 2 criteria. I wanted to get as far away from my old life as possible, and I needed it to be hot. At first, I looked at places like California and the Southwest. But California is too expensive, and I don't like old people and snakes, so Arizona and New Mexico were out. Texas is associated with either oil or cowboys, and the Deep South is still Dixie. Accordingly, by process of elimination, I headed down I-95 to the Florida Keys. I plan to settle in Key West. I've heard a lot of good things about the local atmosphere, and I don't mean the weather, but the overall single-guy vibe is so relaxed and party-oriented that I couldn't think of a place more antithetical to my old life. And it's a tropical place. Then, on the way down, I stopped for breakfast at a cafe in Key Largo. Key Largo tourist. But this is the red-headed kind of tourist traffic. Fishermen and divers, not people who just want to drink, have fun and pretend they are Hemingway. And when I looked around the dining room, its working atmosphere somehow attracted me. I thought, this is exactly what I'm looking for. It's far from my old life. and it's a place where I can settle down. As I was leaving, I passed by one of those notice boards that restaurants leave out for local residents, and there was an advertisement for a place for sale that looked interesting. So I went back to the US, and looked at this place. Like all the other homes in the area, it arrived on wheels. But it was much nicer than the one I just sold, and it was cheap. I wrote a check to the local real estate agents, and they were more than happy to hand over the keys to me. When I looked inside, I was delighted to find that it was furnished. Mobile homes with keys do not always have furniture of the same quality as that found in the Palace of Versailles, but some are better than others, and this one was stainless steel and leather. The floor was some convincingly authentic wood laminate instead of plush carpet, and the view opened across the deck directly onto the canal. It was completed with a small dock for boats. The neighbors mostly worked on the piers or in the tourism industry. People on both sides had children, but they were still babies, and the distant crying did not bother me. There were several pensioners, and several seemed to live at the expense of the state or their relatives. But none of my neighbors were the middle-class snobs I've lived with for the last 22 years. I was going to drive my peg here. It was probably important for fishermen to have access to water. The 154 megabit connection was important to me because it was my new trump card. Luckily, the main cable for the keys ran straight through the US. And the main fiber optic cable was only 300 yards away. By the end of the first week, my lair was connected to T1 power. I wanted to fit into the new environment, so I started hanging out at a couple of local taverns. The LR4 is a powerful beast, more akin to the iconic Land Rover Defender in looks and functionality than its more elegant siblings. The locals, who belonged more to a set of disheveled F-150s, didn't know what to make of it. But he was so muscular that he sent the right message. As a result, I began to be accepted as a local rather than a tourist. The Keys is a special place when you are not a visitor. The air is thick with tropical humidity, and the sun is in the climate zone of Cuba, not Orlando. Each day starts with an intense blue morning sky followed by plenty of cumulus clouds on the horizon as things start to warm up. Along the US, there is always traffic, even at night, and as you approach the highway, the smell of exhaust and diesel begins to replace the smells of tropical vegetation, crushed coral, and waterfront. It's been 2.5 years since the infamous Paris trip, and I've started to feel more grounded. I don't know how other people will react to betrayal that destroys life. But in my case, I became an island fortress, completely removed from his feelings and hiding behind thick walls of anger. This wasn't the kind of mood that would lead you to get into bar fights. It was rather like a thick fog of unattainable cynicism. This caused other people to retreat. And that was exactly what I wanted. I was just dead inside. There was no rage, no longing for lost love. I even knew it was a defense mechanism. But I had no intention of changing my behavior. I was never going to trust another being but myself again. In fact, there was one exception to this rule. I still got myself a dog. In my opinion, dogs are the only creatures that a man can truly trust. Mine was mostly Labrador and Shar-Pei, big, wrinkled, and smelly, full of unconditional love and tender kindness, and it was the best companion a man could wish for. We talked constantly. Well, more precisely, I talked and he listened. He was a good listener. I trusted him with all my feelings of hopelessness and boredom. He tilted his head from side to side and stuck out his scratched ears as if to say, "I understand, boss. I was treated poorly too." This dog contributed more to my healing process than a whole group of psychologists and charged much less for its services, just a few full bowls of dog food a day. I really started to feel better. My business idea turned into a much bigger deal than I ever imagined, and it was a significant boost to my battered confidence. The firm has attracted a number of clients. This was all done strictly through the mouth, as they had to maintain a Chinese wall between me and their legitimate lines of business. But we both earned money with a shovel. All of my clients wanted a full basement experience. Most of them were military. These guys had the most to lose if they could be hacked. but there were also a few commercial organizations that really wanted to be protected. I gave them my usual speech about what would happen once I released my flying monkeys, and they all asked for a ball and limits. My services may have been a little harsh and a lot of risk, but it was the only way a CEO could sleep soundly in the information age. I was crawling around the dark web, which is one very dark and dystopian place, looking for people who could carry out a real destruction hack. It wasn't easy because the real masters are an anonymous, faceless group, and most of these people would give the Antichrist a bad name. In fact, they all seemed to be one white Persian cat shorter than the James Bond villain. But they were also complete anarchists, with no specific political agenda, so they were relatively easy to recruit once you found them, if enough money was involved. I paid them in bitcoins. No one in their right mind would deal with these guys on anything other than an anonymous basis. They all had overinflated egos and a complete lack of conscience. If that describes a sociopath, so be it. I was playing at the very top of the mountain, and it required the best of the best. People are sent to prison for actually sabotaging government systems, which is what I did. And I was off the books of my employer. So my goal was to keep each of my minions in iron compartments. This separation ensured that none of them saw a big enough picture to cause any socially harmful damage. Seriously, anyone who trusts a sociopath to do the right thing is either an idiot or just as crazy as they are. My business went smoothly for a year and a half, and I made a lot of money, millions, as it turned out. I had to keep an eye on each project to make sure none of my minions went overboard. But in the end, it was just a job. It wasn't personal, except for one notable case. I'm not a vindictive person. Sorry, did I just say that? What I meant is that I am a horribly vindictive person. So I lovingly gave Charlie Wilkins and my ex-wife to my personal piranha group. It was totally personal. The thought of this old man retiring with a golden parachute just ate me from the inside out. Therefore, I handed it over to one of the Chinese hacker groups. At my direction, they emptied Wilkins' accounts and anonymously donated the loot to charity in Chechnya. No, really don't thank me, and good luck getting this back. They also exposed my ex-wife's new husband as the corrupt, cheating bastard that he was. It became a viral sensation within the internet's 15-second attention span. The bastard's resignation was inevitable. Their financial ruin came as a surprise to both of them. If you want to protect your assets in the information age, you need to keep them under your mattress, not online. I rubbed my hands together with joy, thinking, poor Heather, the men she chooses just can't stay out of trouble. I wonder if she ever knitted the specs. Then, one hot and humid night, everything changed. Buster and I were sitting outdoors in my favorite spot. He looked into the distance, as he often does when he feels content, and I looked into the distance, as I often do when I try to justify my existence. I completely adapted to local conditions, which was a clear indication of how much I have changed. During my marriage, I kept Orvis afloat by dressing like adult clothes, dressing like a real preppy. I had a closet full of vineyard clothes and never wore the same outfit twice. Now I lived in just a pair of dirty old boat shorts, underwear optional. On top, I was wearing a bright Aloha shirt and a faded Under Armour fishing cap, stained with sweat. It was my only wardrobe, and it was all you really need in a climate like the Keys. When I wanted a new shirt, I just bought another cheap one from the tourist shops and threw away the old one. It's better than going to the laundromat. As I sat, a thin figure wearing cut-off denim shorts and a hoodie approached me. His sudden appearance startled me. He said, "Hey, mister," in a voice that was exceptionally high-pitched for a teenager. Perhaps he was younger than I am. He was a small guy, about 5 feet and about 100 pounds. I assumed it was just one of the local teenagers hustling me for some change. Then the child pulled the sweatshirt back, and I saw that the he was a she. I think you would call her a hippie if such people still existed. Her hair was thick, brown, cut short, and she wore no makeup at all. She didn't need it because her face was almost blindingly perfect, and her eyelashes were so long and thick that they seemed artificial. But it was her eyes that made her irresistible. They were an incredible shade of jade green, too big for her face, almost like an anime character's. Her nose was exquisite, and her mouth was a sarcastic rosebud. Otherwise, she was built like a girl. I asked, "Does your mom know you're harassing people here?" She chuckled and said, "I haven't lived with my mother for 10 years. I left home when I was 18, and I'm never going back." I laughed and said, "Really? Seriously? You're not a day older than 14, so stop messing with me or I'll flip you over my knee." She laughed mockingly and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Aren't you the same Thomas Miller Meissner who used to live at 1539 Greenbrier Lane, whose children Thomas Jr. and Susan are both Pell Grant recipients at Marquette University, and whose ex-wife Heather Whittaker is now in bankruptcy court?" I looked into her eyes. They were no longer soft green jade. They were as hard as emeralds. A chill ran through me. I tried to sound casual when I said, "How did you find me?" She may have looked 14, but she was one of my henchmen, and she could make anyone's life hell. She turned back into a teenager and said cheerfully, "I'm the one who hacked your ex-wife and her two friends." It didn't take a genius to connect all the dots. Crap. The only time I became stupid was when I had to face someone like her. I said irritably, "But I gave this project to the Red Dragon Revolution," she said with amusement. "Yes." I stuttered. "Are you the Red Dragon Revolution?" "But I thought they were Chinese," she said amiably. "That's a good cover, isn't it?" I sat looking at her with my jaw hanging open. She calmly smiled back at me. She could only be 5 feet 1 inch tall. But this woman could do you more harm than several heads of angry Hell's Angels. I said anxiously, "But the Red Dragon Revolution has done a lot of big things in the past 10 years. She said indifferently, "Thank you." I said with growing concern, "Aren't they one of the groups that the Mafia and the Bratva use?" She smiled benevolently and said, "Sometimes." "Fabulous, and she is also connected," I said, completely dumbfounded. "But the Red Dragon Revolution controls the largest zombie network on the internet." She smiled evasively and said, "I don't know, the biggest one, but it serves my purposes." I said, overcome with emotion, "And weren't they the ones who wrote the IP4 worm that crashed the internet for several hours?" She smiled modestly and said, "Only in industrialized countries." Ugh, I should have asked the obvious question. "So what are you doing here?" She said, "I have come to warn you. I went through your life with a comb, and you seem like a decent guy for a pseudo. I am especially sorry for what happened to you. I made her suffer as much as possible, in case you were wondering." She beamed like a mischievous little girl, which was scary. I am not a brave person. I wanted to throw my hands up and run screaming back to my trailer and hide in one of the closets. But based on what this deadly little girl had just told me, I knew I had to keep talking to her. I said, "You wanted to warn me about what?" I didn't think I was going to like what she was about to say. But I realized that people with the best kung fu know everything. And Red Dragon was the hacker queen. So what she was about to tell me was important. She actually looked at me with sympathy. Until that moment, she had been watching me like a snake ready to eat a bird. And the fact that she still seemed more like a homeless girl than a fatal woman was completely unimportant. The best of them are born with talent, and it shows itself very early. She said, "I'm afraid your efforts were a little too successful. You took a lot of money from very bad people. That's why the community has announced a reward for you, and you need to disappear." I intuitively believed her. The problem with success is that it sets you apart from others. And I knew what happens to people when a hacker culture decides to get personally involved. Your secrets become public knowledge, you have no money left, your credit score drops to 0, and the police will be looking for you. I was also confident that whoever wanted to receive the award would be able to do so. I asked the obvious, "How can I trust you not to take this award?" She laughed loudly and said, "I could have exposed you a long time ago. Why do I need money? I take whatever I want. My flight here and my rental car were paid for by the guy you sent me named Wilkins." I was so shocked that I blurted out, "You mean you didn't give his money to the Chechens? It was unimportant. It didn't matter. I know." I'm an idiot, she said, still having fun. What does that have to do with anything? You may have 72 hours to disappear, otherwise very bad things will start happening to you and everyone you know. I'm here to make it happen. Then she stopped and mischievously said, "So let's get back to you." I could almost hear the sexual innuendo in her tone of voice, but I was old enough to be her father. In fact, my daughter Susie was only 7 years younger than my new deadly friend. Besides, she might be 28, but she still had the sex appeal of a prepubescent teenager. I knew what would happen. She needed to use my equipment to kill me, and in the transition period, I was going to literally become a new person. Essentially, the gods had pulled the rug out from under me once again, just like that fateful Friday almost 4 years ago. It was like being struck by lightning. At one point, I was living a life of peace and satisfaction, like Tommy Meissner. The next moment, Tommy Meissner died very suddenly and unexpectedly. My mind was still trying to figure out what that meant. I was happy for the first time in a long time, and then in an instant it all went away. My complete disappearance would be unbearable if I were still married, but now it didn't matter much to me. However, I was overcome with a strong feeling of nostalgia and regret. The children will think I'm dead. I'll never see them again. My employer, with whom I worked for almost 25 years, was left to bear the responsibility. And my career, which had constituted my entire life up to that point, was over. The feeling of loss was indescribable. I stood up tiredly and motioned for Buster. He stood up and looked at me like, "Who is she, boss?" I started crossing us Highway 1, heading towards my trailer. She walked happily next to me. It didn't come up to my shoulder, and Buster probably weighed more than she did. I said, "I don't want to seem ungrateful, but why should I trust you?" she said. "No offense, I'll show you when we get to 17 Points in a Drive." I said, "Enough, I got it." Then I muttered under my breath, "Show yourself." She was telling the truth. We work on command lines rather than the point and click interfaces that the herd uses. She typed a little, and there was no doubt left. Several groups wanted to serve my head on a platter, and they posted this message on the dark web. I was flattered by the amount of Bitcoin they were offering, but I cost them a lot of ill-gotten loot. I just never expected them to be so barbaric. I assumed the inspiration was organized crime rather than the nerd community. My identity was still anonymous, but my little friend assured me that someone would crack it in a couple of days. She said with admiration, "For an amateur, you are very good, but not good enough to remain hidden from someone like me. So, do you want me to do it or not?" It was as if she was asking which ice cream I would choose, chocolate or vanilla. I held a gun to my own head. I knew I had to do it, but I just couldn't pull the trigger. Tommy Meissner is no more, but I still have questions. I said, "I have saved a lot of money. Will they come with me?" She laughed joyfully and said, "Of course, but you won't need money while I'm with you." I said in bewilderment, "Will you come with me?" She said, "You need to be looked after for a while. Once you get back on your feet, we'll see where we go next. I don't have a dad or a mom, so maybe you can be my dad." This was said with a sly smile. Well, I didn't have kids either now, although my life insurance would have set Tommy and Susie up for a long time, and I could keep an eye on them from the internet. I will never get to hold my grandchildren, but at least I would know about their lives. Ironically, I could follow them on Facebook. It was very sad and unfair, but I knew from the beginning that I was fishing in deep water. I said, "How long will it take?" She looked at me like I was an idiot. She said, "Please, I've been installing tailgates for decades. We can leave tomorrow. What are you going to do about it?" "What are you going to do with it?" She pointed to the trailer. I said, "Can you give it to my kids?" She said, "Sure," I said firmly, allowing no room for argument. "I need to take Buster with me." She looked skeptical. Then she said, "Okay, I can get him ADA certified as a guide dog." "What disability should I list for you?" I said. "What about terminal stupidity?" Then I added, "I don't even know your name." She said lightheartedly, "You can call me Ariadne." I understand. In Greek mythology, Ariadne was a Cretan princess. She helped Theseus escape from the Minotaur, and then Theseus abandoned her as soon as he escaped. I hoped my new friend wasn't making some sarcastic statement. I thought to myself, I wonder what her real name is. The next morning, James Robert Newhouse and his daughter Ariadne packed his things and headed up the U.S. 1. Why would I do something as crazy as just disappear off the face of the earth? It was an easy decision. I knew who I was dealing with. Modern society is too dependent on computers, and the predatory forces at the top of the virtual food chain make a lot of money from this dependence. Most of them are illegal. Anyone who interferes with their cash flow can expect their wrath. I assumed that my small operation would remain under their radar, since it was nothing more than my plan to move after the divorce. But it turned out to be too successful. Cyberspace is like the Wild West. The fastest shooter dictates the rules. There is no sheriff in this town, and therefore the talented black hats never suffer the consequences of their crimes. In fact, they are basically wolves, and the rest of us are a herd of helpless sheep. The only reason any individual sheep haven't been eaten yet is because the wolves haven't gotten to them yet. Well, they've gotten to me now, and that's why I was driving up the U.S., one with his new daughter. Passports, credit cards, and all other paraphernalia of modern life require several days for delivery, so we needed to find a place to hide. In fact, Ariadne was a real wizard when it came to everything related to conspiracy. I still didn't know anything about her, but I knew she was an apex predator. She must have had 10 iron personalities prepared in advance, and that foresight came in handy while we waited for all the pieces of my own personality to fall into place. We decided that the U.S. mainland was too obvious a place to be found. So once all my paperwork arrived, we planned to take our first cruise out of Miami. You ask, why a cruise? Can you think of a more anonymous way to escape? You're boarding a 1,000-foot ship with 6,000 happy people. Then all these people land at each port, like Marines on Iwo Jima. It's easy to get lost in such a crowd anywhere. Ariadne booked us a room at the Fontainebleau Hotel. Again, it was brilliant. If you're being hunted, you hide in a cheap backcountry motel, right? These are people who have nothing to hide, staying in the most pompous place on the planet. The room cost $800 per night, but I'm sure someone unnamed paid for it. Ariadne had a pile of Black American Express cards to draw on. There were some minor issues at the front desk. Buster didn't fit the typical profile of a cute dog, but they had no choice when they checked his guide dog credentials. Being disabled, I needed my big, scary, smelly dog. The only other awkward moment was when we actually went up to our room. This was the biggest number they had, but there was only one bed and I had no intention of sleeping with my daughter. Ariadne laughed and said, "Look at this sofa. It's wider and nicer than most beds. I'm small. I can easily sleep here." I had a gym bag full of things. That was more or less all I had. Ariadne laughed and said, "You'll have to spend it on shopping today, Dad. By the way, me too." She winked conspiratorially and said, "My dad can't be some asshole from Cleveland, and you have to look convincing when you spend all the money you have in your accounts in the Cayman Islands. Let's meet here in the room in a few hours, and I want to see a completely new you." I became completely dependent on Ariadne, so I did exactly what she said. It wasn't because I was allowing a young girl who could have been my daughter to boss me around. It was just that Ariadne was a local, and I was a stranger in this very strange country without notice, I might add, so I would be a fool to ignore her advice. I spent the entire day creating a new me, and in the process, I spent $45,000 at Ida and Harry's and Blue Signature. I assumed that the man I know had grown up in wealth, and so I totally embraced Ralph Lauren's style, high-end, understated, elegant, and adorned with a bit of snobbery. It was difficult to pay for all my purchases. I paid everything on account of the room, and of course they called to confirm. They quickly learned that my purchases were backed by Amex Black. So afterwards, one of the doormen and I carried the entire purchase back to the room on 2 luggage carts. Ariadne returned to the room before me and stood on the balcony, looking out over the Atlantic. I noticed that part of the closet was filled with her new clothes, and there was a pair of partially packed J.W. Hulme leather rolling bags on the floor next to her. Since they matched the two I had just bought, I realized we had spent $8,000 on luggage alone. Who said crime doesn't pay? She surprised me when she returned from the balcony. When I left her, she was a homeless girl in a black sweatshirt. This young woman was a complete stranger. Her thick brown hair was still short and functional, but now they were styled in a sort of cone-back style that highlighted her perfectly proportioned and perfectly coiffed features and her extraordinary jade green eyes. She also put on makeup. She clearly knew what it was. She now looked like a strikingly beautiful and extremely wealthy Wellesley graduate. More interestingly, she very clearly was not built like a 14-year-old girl. She was tiny, and that made her look like a waif. But according to Harry, already knew from the cut-off shorts that she had long, well-shaped legs. Now, in a modest sundress, it was clear that she had toned, rounded hips and small, but full and beautiful breasts. She smiled and twirled a little. She said seductively, "Do you like it?" I said in surprise. "My God, Ariadne, you are wonderful." She blushed and said, "You don't have to persuade me. I'll still take care of you." The meaning of this statement remained ambiguous. I blurted out with deep sincerity, "No, I'm really serious. You are beautiful." And there was no question about it. By any standards, she was an absolutely spectacular little female doll. Her eyes seemed to soften the way girls do when their emotions flare, and she walked on her tiptoes in 4-inch heels that made her long, muscular legs bend in a way that a father shouldn't think about. She kissed me tenderly on the cheek. He looked at me mischievously and said, "Thank you, Daddy." God, where did she get this perfume from? We ate dim sum and Cantonese lobster in Hakkasan. She was such an impeccably gorgeous little gem of a woman that she turned heads as we sat. Half the room thought she was my mistress. They were very disapproving. The other half looked at me benevolently. How sweet, he's inviting his hot little daughter over for dinner. I said, maybe you should order for us, being Chinese and all. She grinned and said, when I work, I'm just the red dragon. All my ancestors are Scotch-Irish. That explained the dark brown hair and contrasting green eyes. In fact, she acted as if we had a loving family relationship. She did such possessive feminine things as straightening my tie and collecting things from my lapels. But it was not lost on me that she was perhaps the most dangerous creature in the entire Miami area, including all the local coral snakes and alligators. It was like being lovingly coddled by one of those 20-foot Everglades pythons. I didn't know whether to be happy or horrified. After dinner, we drank some truly excellent plum wine. I said, "Where do we go next?" "Commandant Mon," she said. "Today is Tuesday. All your documents will appear here in the next couple of days. I booked us on the first flight on Friday morning. It's on one of those celebrity super ships, so we're going to mingle with the crowd. 4 days from Puerto Rico to the Eastern Caribbean, ending on the island of St. Lucia. I want to get off there. I've been to St. Lucia, and it's very good." I asked, "And you?" She looked embarrassed and said, "I'll go with you. Why do you ask?" "Okay, all in," I said. "I really want you to come with me. I know this is crazy considering we both lived single lives on the outskirts, and the only thing I know about you is that you are the Red Dragon. But I said, I have a strange feeling that I can trust you. I trust that you are a decent person and that you have my best interests at heart." I didn't add, "even though you're a famous cyber bandito." I continued, "The longer we are together, the stronger this feeling becomes, and it's confusing where it's taking me. I'm starting to see you as a woman, and given the disaster that happened, the last time I got intimate with a woman, I don't want to repeat." She looked at me with such closeness that I had never experienced from any other person in my life, especially from such a young man. Chronologically, she was only 28 years old. But then again, the Red Dragon was centuries ago. She took my hand, looking deeply into my eyes, and said, "For now, think of me as your guardian angel. We'll still have to keep a lot of distance between Tommy Meissner and Jim Newhouse. We can talk after we're done with this." She sat back in her chair with a smile on her face and said, I will be your loving daughter all this time, and I will keep you safe. You haven't heard my story yet, and you might change your mind about me after I say this, then we can decide what happens next. She looked into my eyes with intensity. I'm never going to leave you unless you won't send me away yourself. Her eyes were sparkling with tears, and she looked absolutely gorgeous. Things were a little awkward when we first returned to the room. We both realized that the father-daughter relationship was just a cover. I, in particular, was also uncomfortably aware that I was about to sleep with a stunning little beauty, a situation that under normal circumstances might have led me to do something inappropriate. And the last thing I wanted was to get involved in any kind of complicated relationship with a woman, especially someone as deadly as Ariadne. But nevertheless, there remained an undertone of physical attraction. It would be super weird if we were actually related by blood. She disappeared into the bathroom. I heard the sounds of brushing teeth, and she came out, dressed in a relatively modest yellow pajama suit made of some silky material. She had worked the previous night killing me, and then resurrecting me in the official records as Jim Newhouse, so I had never seen her in night clothes. She said shyly, I usually sleep naked, but that wouldn't work here. She wasn't trying to be sexy at all. God, this was the last thing we both wanted, but I still had to admit that her tight little body had world-class status. Petite women have the advantage of not needing particularly large assets to look incredibly sexy. Ariadne had a true hourglass shape, with two perfect little buns and a full set of shaped breasts. All this on a rock-solid body, but she still probably weighed about 100 pounds. I made a heroic effort to not stare, but it was impossible not to notice the two small dots protruding from those delicious breasts. I said with a gulp, "See you in a minute," and he went to the bathroom. I went out in a pair of burgundy silk and silk pajamas straight out of I Love Lucy. The girl from Ida and Harry assured me that these are the best fashionable clothes for sleep for men. I wasn't sure about this since I usually sleep in boxers. Meanwhile, Ariadne made the bed in the other room and climbed inside. The outline of her hips and round ass in the tight silk made me say something awkward, so I quickly jumped under the covers and turned off the light. I said, "Good night." She said, "Good night." Her voice was tense. I thought to myself, God, give me strength. My ID showed up on Thursday afternoon. It was an absolutely stunning illustration of modern identity theft. We'd been hanging out like father and daughter for the past 2 days, and the role had begun to fall comfortably on both of us. She teased me a lot, and I looked loving to her. And there was no repeat of the intense attacks of sexual desire that we both felt that first night. The flight to Luis Muñoz Marin Airport in Puerto Rico took 2.5 hours. The 10-mile taxi ride through San Juan traffic to the cruise port felt almost as long as the flight. Ariadne sat and serenely looked out the carriage window. She was wearing a pleated white skirt and blue polo shirt that made her look like she'd spent the last 10 years in high-end prep schools rather than wreaking havoc in cyberspace. Buster squeezed between us, panting from the heat and drooling all over my new khakis. He proudly wore his service dog vest, like a new Marine in his blue dress uniform. This made up for the trip to Puerto Rico in the luggage compartment. He told me in no uncertain terms that he never wanted to go through this experience again. Ariadne was an amazing little chameleon, which probably explained her success as a criminal. She could take on the persona of anyone she wanted, and as our best cover, we chose a single millionaire father with a sophisticated adult daughter. I did have a couple million hidden in numbered accounts. The year and a half I spent in the penetration testing business turned out to be very profitable. But I had a feeling that Ariadne could beat my account balance tenfold. Of course, we didn't spend any money. Ariadne booked us a penthouse suite on the supership Celebrity. Thank goodness this particular suite had 2 single beds. Of course, it was a hack that allowed us to obtain the suite. But no one on the ship was the wiser when Ariadne overflowed the buffer in the reservation system. Cruise ships are small towns that are filled with brand new strangers every week. Essentially, when landing, it feels like everyone is moving into town on the same day. The first evening we ate and attended one of the onboard shows. Sleeping was easy because we each had our own bed. and we fell deeper and deeper into a father-daughter routine. The buster was a bit of a problem because there was limited space for trash, but the couple of hundred who slipped into our room gave the butler access to the ornamental lawn on the upper deck. It was this feature that made us choose this ship in the first place, and Buster was very grateful. The cruise itself was pretty boring. This was because none of us wanted to risk using the ship's ultra-secure onboard internet connection. Ariadne lived in virtual space. That's why she became especially nervous. Neither of us liked to party, but I finally decided to take her to a nightclub on the ship just to blow off some steam. I wore a tuxedo. She wore a small turquoise wrap cocktail dress that hugged her exquisite body. This sight stirred the hearts of every man present. In fact, I realized that I was sitting with a woman who was probably one of the most beautiful women on the ship. Accordingly, Ariadne began to dance a lot. She rejected the first couple. But the third guy was very handsome and seemed to be an all-around decent guy. Ariadne turned to me questioningly. I said, "Of course, sweetie." She stood up, walked out onto the floor, and began performing what seemed to me like a pagan mating ritual. It was a perfect illustration of the difference in our ages. I knew that what she was doing was normal for her peers. I've seen other 20-year-olds dance the same way. The music seemed to flow into them and then flow out again. This resulted in movements that would have been considered obscene in my time, but Ariadne's generation seemed to consider it simply a normal expression of their full sexuality. Oh my God. The last thing I wanted to think about was Ariadne's sexuality. I slept with her every night, but watching her dance actually helped me distance myself a little. I realized that we truly belong to different generations. Of course, I'm also some evil god personally using me as a punching bag. Most people of my generation go from cradle to grave along a beautiful, stable trajectory without any life disasters. None of this applied to me. In one night, I lost the woman I had built a life with. Then, just as suddenly, I found myself running from shadowy forces bent on destroying my newly built life. To make the situation even more difficult, I was assisted in my efforts by a mysterious girl who looked almost 20 years old, and who was perhaps one of the most dangerous women in post-industrial society. Worse, she was exotically beautiful. Given my past history with women and the fact that I was fighting for my life, I would have to be crazy to feel anything other than extreme gratitude towards Ariadne. And yet, as I watched her slow dance with this big, handsome dude, I had very unfatherly emotions. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and he placed his hands on her waist, right above her round little ass, and she leaned back, looking straight into his eyes. There was nothing sexual about it. Their bodies barely touched. It is better to use the term intimate. And again, the way she danced was no different from other girls in their 20s. The problem was that the familiarity between these two gave me an irrational and incredibly strong feeling of jealousy. I wanted to be the one to hold her, and I wanted to be the one who swam in those bottomless jade green eyes. I knew this feeling was crazy. I didn't even know her real name. But here it is. Then she made things much worse. The music ended, and they laughed. She grabbed his hand and slid over to where I was sitting. I tried not to look like the green-eyed monster actually ate me alive. She said lightheartedly, "Frank wants to take me to the masked bar." "Can I, Daddy, please, please?" I tried to sound fatherly when I said, "Sure, but you better not bother me when you come. I am going to sleep." She said, "Thank you, Dad," and squeezed my hand in a loving, daughterly gesture. They went together. He was my height, so when they left, they both looked like he was taking his little sister somewhere. That is, unless you count those perfect swaying hips and the twitching of those two perfect little buns. I didn't know this was possible, but I actually felt a greater sense of hopelessness and loss than when I saw Heather kiss Wilkins before the trip. I was almost sure that Ariadne would spend the night with this dude. At least that's what it looked like. So I was surprised to hear them both laughing together as they walked down the hallway. Only an hour and a half passed. Of course, all this time I lay in the dark with my eyes wide open and my heart pounding, listening to the noise of the ship and the work of the engines. There was a short pause at the door, accompanied by a faint groan. And then the door opened, and the light from the hall illuminated her as she silently slipped into the room. She undressed in the dark and quietly slipped into her bed. She rustled for a few minutes and then fell silent, falling asleep in the sleep of innocence. It really was a very unpleasant situation. As the Red Dragon, she may pose a threat to post-industrial society, but like Ariadne, she was dangerous to my very soul. I knew that I was falling in love with her, and love and trust were luxuries that I absolutely could not afford. Heather drained that account to zero. The next morning, I showered and dressed in khaki pants and a Ralph Lauren polo shirt. I found Ariadne in the living room of the suite, reading USA Today. She wore a white tropical linen dress. The dress showed off her trim little body and gorgeous legs. Her legs were a real work of art. I noticed this back in her cut-off jeans and hoodie days, but in some ways they were more special with their 4-inch heels and shiny new look. The sophisticated look seemed to come naturally to her. Her ability to don the mantle of privilege was so convincing that it was superb acting, or she actually came from big money. She smiled brightly and said, "Last night was wonderful. Thank you." I said jokingly, in a mockingly stern voice, "I hope you didn't do anything that Dad wouldn't approve of." She looked at me a little more seriously than I expected and said, "Don't even think about it. We drank and talked, and he kissed me at the door. That's all. You have to get it in your thick head that my loyalty is to you and only you, which raises an important question." She focused on me as if she wanted to make sure I understood what she was going to say. She said, "Every inch of the public area of this ship is monitored by cameras, and each of them can be hacked remotely. I know this because I've already hacked into their system with my phone. Don't you think that's true? Would it be a little weird if someone saw me turning down guys my age to hang out with my dad?" While she was talking, I was thinking, devoted to me? What the hell does that mean? She added, "Besides, I want you to find someone tonight too. We'll be arriving in St. Lucia in a couple of days, and we'll get off there. In the meantime, we need to put on a credible show just for appearances." I said, "So you thought we'd get off there?" She replied casually, "Yes, my family has a place there. We can hide out there until the bounty is lifted. We need to keep you so far under the radar that they'll be convinced you're dead." I said interestingly, "You never told me about your family." She waved it off. "If we decide to continue, I'll have to tell you." She left it up to me to decide what continue meant. That evening, we returned to the nightclub. I was in a tuxedo, and she was in a classic little black dress. It ended a few inches above her knees. Those incredible legs left a lasting impression, and with pearl jewelry and black patent leather shoes, she was simply gorgeous. The hoodie didn't reveal much about her breasts, and from then on she wore polos or high-necked cocktail dresses. This dress was cut out at the front. I enhanced her breasts to stunning levels. They could be relatively small compared to the Sports Illustrated supermodels, but they were so high and tightly packed, and her chest was so well developed that her small breasts were impressive. This discovery added another drop of anxiety to my already precarious state. I'm a total boob lover. Heather had an impressive pair of breasts, and even in her chubby housewife stage, they were fun to play with. Now my guardian angel was showing off a round, firm pair of melons that almost put Heather in the shade. This did fall into the category of cruelty to mortal men. My task for the evening was to find someone my age. I understood why Ariadne wanted me to do this. We continued to support the legend of father and daughter, and it was a cruise, so the father will probably be looking for some strange woman of his. Ariadne easily met men. In fact, they came in droves to our table. She danced with several of them, including her friend from yesterday. I finally plucked up the courage to walk up to a table full of women who were clearly either divorcees on a girls' cruise or married women sowing their wild oats. Their status didn't matter. My only job was to find one, cut her out of the herd, and spend some time with her. They all looked at me expectantly. My name is not Clooney or Grant, but I have developed some social skills. Ever since Heather so unceremoniously kicked me out, there was a short, dark-haired Latina with impressive breasts. There was a tall redhead with a model build and a blonde who looked like a California beach bunny from the Clinton administration. I thought to myself, blonde, brunette, or redhead, what a trivial choice. I said, smiling at the whole table, would any of you lovely ladies like to dance? The blonde, who was by far the most beautiful of the three, jumped out of her chair like a shot, dragged me to the dance floor. She was still hot, in some ways about 40 years old, and she was probably a knockout 15 to 20 years ago. She was wearing enough gold to stock a Mayan temple, and she was simply beaming. Recently divorced, successful in settlement. We booked for a while and eventually ended up next to Ariadne. My pseudo-daughter turned away from the guy she was dancing with. He couldn't take his eyes off her desperately whipping buns. Ariadne turned to me and we exchanged glances. She said matter-of-factly, "Hi, Dad," and all the while her legs and hips were rotating in a way rarely seen outside of primitive birthrights babies. My partner, who danced the same way as me and ran like an old man, made a double conclusion. She said, "She's your daughter," I said, "for the last 28 years. She looked at her again and said, "Amazing. She looks exactly like Chelsea Hughes. Her parents were my friends in Washington." Well, that little coincidence certainly allowed the skunk to break free at the Women's Bridge Club. I said, "Let's take a break for a second," and I led her to a comfortable table. It didn't work because the music was still deafening, so I said, "Let's go have a drink." My partner obviously thought she was going to get lucky. She became very flirtatious. I walked up to the Globe and Atlas pub. She held my hand as if we were a couple and sat down at a cozy table for two. My partner was a real beauty. The flower was a little different from a rose, but not so much that it was not noticed. And in her youth, she must have been a world-class beauty. Long, natural, dirty blonde hair, blue eyes, and facial features so aesthetically perfect that you just wanted to hang her on the wall and look at her, like Rembrandt. The rest of her in a tight black dress gave new meaning to the term brick shit house. I assumed that the second wife's trophy had recently been replaced with a newer model. She showed me all the bouncing crossed legs, the deep, exposed cleavage that women do when they can't wait to get to the fun stuff. I would probably take it right on the table. Except that on a cruise, adultery is only allowed in the rooms. More importantly, I didn't want to set any precedents for Ariadne. If I had slept with someone, then Ariadne would have the same moral right. And the thought that some random stud had driven her into a coma caused me extreme emotional distress, much worse than the week Heather spent in Paris. I kept telling myself that Ariadne was 19 years younger and that she was a legendary cyberspace daredevil. Not to mention, she was literally my guardian angel. None of these arguments touched my fevered brain. I couldn't deny the completely unreasonable desire to hold her and make her mine. And the woman sitting across from me knew something I needed to find out. I said, "Did you live in Washington?" She said, "Yes, my ex-husband was a vice president at General Dynamics in Falls Church. I live in Georgetown now." I said, "You mentioned that my daughter looks a lot like Chelsea Hughes. It seems like it means something to you. I'm wondering who this Chelsea Hughes is and why you remember her." My partner looked a little disappointed. She thought I was about to ask an important question, to you or to me. No matter how beautiful a woman was, she could find many bed partners, and I was wasting her precious time if I didn't move in that direction. It was for this reason that she began to take a look at one of the lizards hiding in the bar. She seemed to be broadcasting, "Come, save me from this nerd." But in the meantime, she answered my questions. She said, "Chelsea's father is Bill Hughes. He's a big shot in DC security." I knew Hughes. It's actually a very small community at the top, and we all know each other. In fact, in my short, happy life as a freelance pen tester, I subcontracted a couple of jobs with him. My partner continued. "A few years ago, Hughes invited my ex-husband and I to one of those low-key picnic concerts in Yards Park near the Navy Yard. Hughes and his whole family were there. That's where I met Chelsea." She seemed to be looking back in her mind as she said, "She is the second of Hughes' 4 children and the oldest of the children he had with his second wife. I remember her because she was such a beautiful girl. Her mother is a stunning beauty, and I was Miss Teen California myself, but neither of us could compare to Chelsea when we were her age. Your daughter is an exact copy for her. I looked with interest at the woman opposite me. This seemed to inspire her. Perhaps she mistook my deep focus for newfound passion. In any case, she added, the strangest thing about Chelsea was that she went to MIT, not a college for intelligent women like Holyoke or Radcliffe. How could such a beautiful girl find a suitable husband on a campus full of weirdos? She laughed cheerfully. Clearly, it was an inexplicable quirk on Chelsea's part that she was actually interested in nerds. At that moment, the dude she was playing eye contact with appeared and cheerfully said, "Can I join you too? You seem to be having a good time." "And I'm always ready to have a good time, subtle," I said. "Of course, I have to go anyway. I need to make sure my daughter isn't kidnapped by some horny dude in a nightclub." I glanced pointedly at my new table mate. He missed it completely. I then turned to my partner and said sincerely, "It was nice meeting you, and I hope to see you again." She didn't recognize me either. She was too busy focusing her take-me look on her next victim. I went outside and leaned against the rail of the ship. The Gulf Stream water boiled in a silvery cascade in the powerful wake of the ship. The night was crystal clear, warm, and fragrant, and one of the huge Caribbean moons hung on the horizon like a bright yellow plate. Meeting this woman could have been a strange coincidence. But this was not beyond the realm of possibility. It makes sense that the cruise would have included a woman traveling in Hughes' peer group, since it was both expensive and exclusive. It was a bit more of a coincidence that I met someone who knew Chelsea Hughes, but this was not completely ruled out. The woman I spoke to was destined to inevitably go to the ship's nightclub, narrowing the odds to about 30 to 1 on any given night. So I had a name. There was no reason to do anything with this knowledge, at least not until Ariadne and I were able to give up the pretense of father and daughter. But I had some useful experiences. In fact, Ariadne was the daughter of one of the smartest guys I know. More importantly, there were rumors that his wife was much smarter and even more strong-willed than him. In fact, I heard that his wife was one of the hottest MILFs in a city that prides itself on trophy women. This explains the enormous intelligence and killer appearance of my imaginary daughter. The deciding factor, and what really convinced me that Ariadne was Chelsea, was the connection to MIT. Hughes does exactly what Ariadne does. He's essentially a hacker. He's just a white hat, and based on her iconic exploits, Ariadne's hat was much grayer. However, any woman who could get into MIT was clearly exceptional at everything Ariadne was good at. So the evidence points directly to Chelsea Hughes. I returned to the nightclub to tell Ariadne that I was returning to my room. She danced languidly with the same guy as last night, arms around his neck, head resting on his chest, pushed towards him. I couldn't see his hands, but they seemed to be much further down her back, and perhaps resting on those wonderful buns. This was clearly more than just a pretense to sell our story. She enjoyed the romance. But of course, she was a young woman, and he was a handsome man, and the atmosphere of the cruise ship's own world makes reality seem long ago and distant. I was again overcome by a causeless attack of jealousy. God, this was getting ridiculous. I had no grievances with the girl who was young enough to be my daughter, and she didn't owe me anything. She has already saved my life, so to speak. The dark forces she fought for me probably wouldn't have killed me, but they would leave me to live under the bridge support for the rest of my short and miserable life. I approached the two of them. The guy gave me a pleasant smile. He actually really seemed like a nice guy. Ariadne said, "Hey, Dad, are you coming back to the room?" I said, "Old people need rest, my dear. You both have fun." Ariadne said very pointedly, "I'll be back in about an hour." I said, "I'll probably get up, but if not, I'll see you in the morning." It just killed me to say this. I was almost sure that I wouldn't see her until the morning. As I was leaving, I saw them kissing. Ariadne was clearly carried away by the moment. My 24-year-old wife flew to Paris and spent a week having sex with a dirty old man. And now I was losing a woman to a very handsome and completely decent guy on a cruise. I felt much worse about my daughter's lack of figure than about my wife. So I received a bottle of Johnny Walker Blue on my ship's account. I didn't pay for it anyway, and I sat on the couch and drank away my sorrows for $100 a drink. An hour has passed. I almost got to the point where I was wondering which side of the balcony to jump from. Then I heard the same cheerful voices coming from the hall. It was a surprise. Just in time. There was a much longer moment, a louder groan, and then the door opened. Ariadne stood there, looking happy and excited, but not at all concerned, thank God. She said lightheartedly, "Pour me some of this, okay?" I poured her a glass and handed it to her. She plopped down on the sofa and laid her head on my shoulder. It was a gentle gesture, not sexual in the least. She reached out and stroked my cheek lovingly. She teased, "I see you scored." I said just as jokingly, "Not like you." God, I sounded like such a pathetic little bitch. She tensed, turned, and said in surprise, "Do I sense a hint of jealousy in your voice?" "Destroyed," I said. "In the short time that I have known you, I began to look at you as a woman. As I told you back in Miami, this could be problematic. I loved Heather for 24 long years, if you count the courtship. Then, out of the blue, she just suddenly decided to run off with some guy who was never going to do anything other than fuck her." I smiled grimly and said, "Forget about the heartache that will result. I think you understand that this will cause trust issues." Since then, I have felt no emotions other than emptiness and deep suspicion when it comes to women. I looked at her with love and said, "And then you come into my life, and everything about you becomes so beautiful and full of joy. More importantly, you chose to protect me. I didn't force you to do this. It was something you decided on your own. So it's natural to have feelings for you, want to trust you and get closer to you, but you're also half my age, and the generation gap seems insurmountable." I winced and said, "The guy you were with tonight is perfect. He's handsome, seems very sweet and funny. Moreover, he's from your generation. The woman I was talking to is completely the right age. She's beautiful and sexy, and she's the one I would normally spend the night with, getting to know her a lot better. But all I could think about was you and what you did." I added with noticeable emotion in my voice, "So I went looking for you, and there you are, courted by the right guy, the guy I would want my daughter to be with. This is a completely understandable, appropriate, and even desirable outcome for two beautiful people being together. But it just tore me apart. So yes, I guess I'm jealous. Jealous of your youth and all the opportunities you still have ahead of you. Moreover, I'm jealous of every man who has the opportunity to hug you like that." She looked at me carefully. Her eyes were light. "Finally," she said, "when I accepted your assignment, I also examined you in my own special way. It was a scary thought. A hacker as capable as Ariadne knew more about my life than I did. She could read things I had never seen, for example, comments in school files, credit reports, and performance evaluations. She looked at me with tenderness and said, "What I found was that you were a truly decent, honest, and caring person who did your best in the face of any kind of obstacle. I also learned how exceptional, strong you are, smart and creative. And to be honest, I have fallen hopelessly in love with a faceless man as deeply as a woman can. Since we met, you have been everything I ever expected and more, meaning that my feelings for you arose long before we met in person." Then she looked at me sharply, as if she was trying to convey an important message, and said, "That's why I broke my cover and went from Boston to Key Largo. You need my help. But that's not the reason I'm really here. I'm here because I believe that you are my life partner, and the women in my family choose a partner for life." She added with a flirtatious smile, "What you saw tonight was nothing more than my way of relieving some of the stress you've been building up in me. It was to maintain our cover, but honestly, that's not the reason I did it. I love romance, and you can't give it to me yet, so I'm enjoying some harmless flirting with a very cute guy." Then she winked at me benevolently and said, "Soon you will find out what really happens when I give myself to a man. It will be nothing like what you have seen so far. I have given my soul to only one person, and that is you. This commitment works. Much longer than we've actually been together." She finished by saying, Yes, you are old enough to be my father, and that may be more obvious now than it will be when I'm 60 and you're 79. But I feel like our souls match so smoothly that I know why you feel like you can trust me. Then she added, with sincerity, I tell you to follow your instincts because I will never betray you and will be your friend, companion, and lover for the rest of your days. Wow, we just sat there, looking at each other with desire. I began to reach out to her, and you could see the security doors slamming shut in her magnificent mind. She said with steely determination, if I let this genie out of the bottle, we won't leave the cabin until we're back in Miami, and it won't serve our current purposes. We'll have a lifetime to love each other the way we do. Let's convince the dark internet that Tommy Masner really disappeared. She pushed herself back, stood up, and said, by the way, if you're wondering, I just saw the most intimate I'll ever be with another man. Your attraction lies in your unwavering strength, personal devotion, and devotion, which is what I've always been looking for in a man, and you can expect an equal measure of reciprocity from me. In the meantime, I think I should take an ice-cold shower and go to bed. Do you need a cold shower too? I looked at her as honestly as I could and said, no, I don't need to. What you just said brings me more satisfaction and deeply moves me than any sexual experience I've ever had. I looked into my heart and see that I really trust you. In fact, I trust you so much that I am not going to add the usual reminder that you don't betray that trust. I know you won't because I know how sincere you are and giving personality, and I guarantee you that we will still be kicking off the accelerator when I am truly 79 and you are only 60. You will never regret giving yourself to me. And so the endless unreality of the cruise continued. I ran into my friend from the nightclub a few times. She was always with some skinny, tanned, age-inappropriate studome. Every time we encountered her, she carefully examined Ariadne, and Ariadne began to try her best to avoid her. Perhaps my pseudo-daughter also remembered something. The last stop before St. Lucia was Martinique. Ariadne, her new friend, and I spent the day shopping and touring rum distilleries. This seemed like a completely fatherly thing to do to my daughter and her boyfriend. For his part, the child was a very good person. His name was Frank. He was the network manager for the Dairy Farmers Association, headquartered in Kansas City. He was 29 years old and played basketball at K-State. He kept calling me sir, which made me feel a little older than Methuselah. He clearly found Ariadne very attractive. Naturally, she encouraged him like a girl, holding his hand as they walked, and generally hanging on to him when they stood together. And of course it killed me, but to my utter surprise I found that I both understood what she was doing and, more importantly, trusted her. This feeling intensified every time Frank approached the line of intimacy that Ariadne had undoubtedly drawn. One day he was so bold that he put his hand on her shoulder and placed it on one of her perfect round melons. Ariadne did not speak to him for an hour. He addressed me, and I sat down while she sulked at a private table in the St. James tasting room. I said, Frank is sorry, sweetie. He said he wouldn't do anything like that again. Frank loomed worriedly in the background. She gave me a penetrating and very significant look and said in a whisper, remember what I told you. My body is meant for you and only you. She then said in a voice that Frank could hear, okay, Daddy, I accept Frank's apology. She then turned to Frank and said in a threatening voice, this better not happen again, do you hear? But she softened the edge of her statement by walking over and kissing Frank sweetly. He wriggled his whole body like a happy puppy. Ariadne's special little statement made me extremely excited, so I sat at the table for a couple more seconds. I looked at her holding Frank's hand and chatting with him. She was wearing some stylish short shorts, clean, expensive, modern chic. They showed off her gorgeous legs, thighs, and ass in a manner that was very cruel to all the horny old men in the area. Some guys might like the bird legs of a fashion model, but women with well-developed and muscular calves and thighs are irresistible to me. My ex-wife had beautiful legs, but Ariadne's legs were sculptural masterpieces. They were muscular, as if she had grown up doing gymnastics or dancing, but they were too long compared to her tiny body. They ended in firm, round hips and a round ass that screamed both powerfully and fruitfully. She stood and waited patiently, holding her boyfriend's hand, thrusting one of her stunning round thighs forward. Finally, I took control of the situation and said, "Well, I'm going back to the ship." Ariadne said, "You and Frank can go back alone. I want to go shopping a little more." Frank said eagerly, "I can stay with you." But Ariadne said too hastily, "No, I want to explore the surroundings without a man looking over my shoulder." Any sensible guy would distance himself from a woman when she said something like that. So Frank and I returned to the ship. I knew that Ariadne was heading to the internet cafe. I was getting dressed for dinner when she burst into the room looking excited. She said, "I just checked. They are thinking about canceling the award. Most of them think you're dead. There are still a few holdouts, but I spent some time convincing them to become a reality." Obviously, the Red Dragon was working in virtual space on my behalf. One of the most alarming things about my new situation was how easily I could forget who Ariadne really was. The next day, the ship took us to the city of Castries, the capital of the sovereign island nation of St. Lucia. We were just off the coast of South America, and the weather was truly equatorial, meaning there was a ton of sunshine and the sea breeze barely kept up with the humidity. The greenery was lush, even more so than on the northern part of the Windy Range, and the smell was tropical. Our room on the ship had air conditioning. That was the reason why Buster looked at me as if I was crazy when I said, "Let's go for a walk, old man." But we were going to get off and leave everything behind, including Frank. It was a complete disappearance. I didn't pack anything, and Ariadne too. We could buy everything we needed as soon as we landed. Everything we had brought up to this point had been paid for by someone else, and we were able to purchase everything we needed thanks to Ariadne's special skills. So it was easy to just leave everything behind except my dog. Ariadne's family had a villa in the Cap Estate area on the northern tip of the island, west of Rodney Bay. The city of Castries is located south and east of there. We stopped the Creole in a decrepit 1950s Plymouth. It looked like he was offering a taxi and God knows what else. His name was Jean-Claude. He had a classic island accent and fast-paced way of speaking, and all the way to the homestead, he couldn't stop talking about the people who lived there. The villa belonged to three sisters and their families. One of them was Bill Hughes and his wife. This was already established as Ariadne was going to use it. The other two were sisters of Hughes' wife along with their husbands. Jean-Claude said that he was a long-time close companion of his younger sister's husband while he was here in St. Lucia. In fact, the guy met his future wife here. The other sister was a millionaire businesswoman, and it was her money that bought the place. Jean-Claude told us that this sister was married to some mysterious character who the locals believed was working for the CIA. We got there, and it was truly impressive. Jean-Claude dropped me, Ariadne, and Buster off at the gate. It was only a 15-foot wrought iron specimen. Ariadne walked over to the keyboard, which was part of the speaker built into the right pillar. She entered the 8-digit identification code. The gate began to open silently, and we walked along a path of crushed white coral towards the house, which I still could not see through the trees. We turned the bend, and a breathtaking sight appeared before us. The mansion itself fits neatly into the side of a lush green ridge that extends about a quarter of a mile down to a 50-foot cliff above the bluest ocean imaginable. The buildings sparkled white. The grounds were lush, landscaped, and perfectly manicured. The whole area smelled of flowers and palm trees, and all you could hear were the sounds of the ocean, tropical birds, and someone cutting grass in the distance below. I said with admiration, "This is really a lot of money." Ariadne actually said, "This is my Aunt Mary. My mom and dad are doing well financially, but they couldn't just shell out $4 million in cash like Aunt Mary could. She bought the place out of the blue to use as a retreat to help her new husband recover. He was wounded in Mexico, where they met. I don't know the whole story, and I don't want to know it. But my Aunt Millie was treating Mary's husband. She's a world-renowned surgeon, so she was the right person for this." I thought to myself, yes, The women in Ariadne's family are all as exceptional as she is. We walked towards the house with that metaphorical elephant dancing next to us. I wanted to get rid of our nasty pachyderm as quickly as possible. So I said, "I know who you really are, Chelsea." She didn't look surprised. She said, "I was pretty sure that bitch recognized me. She's the ex-wife of my dad's friend. She got a lot of money after the divorce, even though she was the one who cheated." I thought, does anyone ever remain faithful? Chelsea continued, "That's right, my real name is Chelsea Hughes. I'm almost 29 years old and MIT graduate, and I work for Motorola in Marlborough, Massachusetts. My dad's name is Bill Hughes, and my mom's name is Maddie. I'm a pretty normal girl. As far as possible in my family, no one knows about my other identity, and I, of course, want to keep it a secret." I said with a smile, "You're not the Red Dragon, and Tommy Meissner is dead. We keep each other's secrets." She responded with a smile. It was like I surprised her. I said that. She said, "Always together, just you and me, no people between us. We start over from here. I can't believe it. I've dreamed of this all my life. One man, one love." Her statement gave me another erection. St. Lucia is a former French island. Therefore, it is natural that the housekeeper was French. She greeted Chelsea like a long-lost relative. This was a completely different side of my young friend. New role, beautiful little family princess. It was strange, especially knowing what I knew about her. The princess personality was no match for Chelsea's brilliant mind or the Red Dragon's accomplishments. Apparently, Chelsea was always a beauty, someone who was a debutante. I could imagine how exhausting it must have been for her to carry all these aristocratic, white glove expectations, especially for a fiery personality like Chelsea's. And that was probably the reason she rebelled. Red Dragon was definitely on the opposite end of the spectrum from the girlish identity her family had forced upon her. Finally, I asked her to tell me how she became such a great hacker. We sat on the patio in her little slice of heaven, watching the gorgeous tropical day unfold. I said, "You must have had a very hard time growing up. Suppose that was the reason you turned to a life of crime." She smiled a dark smile and said, "You have no idea. The expectations for a girl like me have always been heartbreaking." She continued with some heat in her voice. "My parents are rich and I'm beautiful. Both of them are relatively enlightened, at least when it comes to bourgeois ideas about raising girls, especially my mother. But they just couldn't see beyond my appearance." She added with some indignation in her voice, "My older half-brother Billy, who I love very much, by the way, flies with the Blue Angels, and my little sister Janie plays on the U.S. women's national soccer team. My little brother Tom is a hacker and a miracle like me, but he is a white hacker. In fact, we were on opposite sides of several cases." She smiled slyly. I knew it was him, but no one would have guessed that the Red Dragon was little Chelsea Hughes, the beauty from Georgetown. Both my father and Aunt Millie's husband are major computer security specialists. They worked with Tom all the time he was growing up to make him who he is. But they didn't even consider working with me to be anything other than the family jewel and the perfect bride. I could hear the anger in her voice as she said, "So as soon as I got to MIT, I started studying the dark side. The class itself was boring and too easy, so I had a lot of free time. Plus, I had access to the entire hacker culture through the student population. I thought to myself, boring, easy, what kind of woman is she?" Chelsea was on a roll now. She said, "The more I did the hacking, the better I got at it. I started with simple little things, and it was more of a social activity. It was like a game among the students. But they were too easy, so I started doing some trivial things. Professional jobs on the dark web. I loved the feeling of being a villain, and I got better and better until I eventually got the reputation I have now." She said with bitterness rather than vanity, "I was still beautiful Chelsea, and I was still living the preppy girl life that is inevitable in the Cambridge area. But I was doing much more intense hacking, and that took up all my time. So, that I stopped having a social life." She looked at me seriously and said, As you know, the internet is a world in itself, and it was the only place where I was judged on my merits and not on the size of my ass. It was liberating, and I became addicted. I did everything necessary to maintain the appearance that my life was what it had always been, sweet little Chelsea, going to work and occasionally visiting single girls' clubs. But my only reality was in cyberspace as the Red Dragon, and I was extremely lonely. Her gaze was thoughtful. This was the expression I wore all the time before I met her. She said, I didn't have anyone I felt a kinship with, so I was completely emotionally closed off. That is, until I got your assignment. At first, I thought you were just a boring person with a grudge. But the more I looked into your biography, the more I began to understand who you were, how cruelly you were wronged, and how bravely you faced problems, so I went deeper. Her face brightened, and she said, the more I studied you, the closer my soul became to yours, until I developed an absolute attachment to you. It was an all-consuming attraction, although you were still only the face of a nameless client. There was no way to contact you without sacrificing my anonymity, and I couldn't trust you enough to do so. Then my colleagues put you in danger, and I knew I had to act no matter what the consequences would be for me. She looked at me seriously and said, I want to be honest with you. I probably stole $400 or $500 million during my time as the Red Dragon, most of which the company didn't even realize they had lost. I gave most of it away. What I got from these adventures, to charities and people in need. I saved several millions to build my nest. But I have never intentionally harmed anyone in my life with the exception of your ex-wife and her friends. They deserved what happened to them, and I can be quite medieval when someone I love is hurt. She gave a short glance of satisfaction. It was like remembering something particularly pleasant, a nice lunch or a particularly fun day at the beach. It was amazing. I realized that even before we met, I was important to her. Her ability to empathize with me through the events of my life was a far more amazing achievement of intelligence than her known abilities in cyberspace. She grinned darkly and continued, no one will ever catch me because I'm a ghost. Cyberspace is convenient face-to-face and anonymous for people like me. I already knew that. But she laid all her cards on the table, and it seemed important to me to let her finish her confession. She said proudly, everyone thinks that the Red Dragon Revolution is a conglomerate of hackers in China. Even the most astute investigator would never guess that the entire organization is actually just a 28-year-old girl living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I completely understood what she was saying. Thanks to 256-bit encryption and an infinite number of proxies, it is absolutely impossible for a hacker of her caliber to ever be caught. However, Chelsea's hacking didn't bother me any more than her sexual history. That was in the past, in a different context. Now she chose to be solely devoted to me, and this choice was the basis of my faith in her. You really can't love someone if you don't trust them. Trust is built on a shared history of life decisions, and these decisions are driven by each person's ability to understand and care about the impact of their actions on their partner. For 22 years, Heather and I were more or less on the same page. Then she lost that connection. This fact was evident in her harmful behavior. This lack of empathy led her to make one very bad choice, at least as far as I was concerned. In fact, her inability to make the right choice was the main reason it was so easy for me to leave her. On the other hand, there was no doubt that Chelsea and I were on the same page in understanding and personal respect for each other. So I was confident that when faced with any choice involving me, she would choose wisely. Therefore, it was absolutely obvious in my mind that I could trust her. I said, okay, I know how you got here, and you obviously know how I got here. So what are you going to do next? She looked at me lovingly and said, I will be your lifelong companion and lover. This will continue until we have children, and then we will also become parents. She paused and looked at me seriously. She said, I know you've been a wonderful father. I also know this is a second chance for you. Unfortunately, so I'm ready to raise our kids without much help from you. I come from a big family and I love children, so I want to have 3 or 4. Chelsea's assumptions were logical. Moreover, they showed how much she cared about me. I actually was there, and I actually had all the parent t-shirts. But Chelsea did not understand that she was offering me a revival. The first time I did everything right, got married, had children. This aspect of my life has been very satisfying. Then the fruits of that labor were taken from me by Heather's Paris adventure. After the inevitable divorce, I felt like my entire life on this earth had been wasted. Then this beautiful little angel dropped out of the virtual space and created a truly new beginning for me. Essentially, I was allowed to relive all the satisfying experiences of my past married life and perhaps not make the same mistakes. My relationship with Heather was the typical ill-considered, hot-blooded coupling that every normal child does. This time, my beautiful Chelsea and I were going to discuss all the conditions and agreements. Her obvious personal integrity and intellectual confidence reassured me that I could discuss sensitive issues with her in a rational manner. I knew that after this, I could be sure of her absolute devotion, but I needed to put my cards on the table, just in case. I said, "Are we talking about marriage? If so, then I have two conditions." Her face darkened. I knew she expected some classic stupid rules from me. I said, "First of all, I want you to leave the Red Dragon. He's already done enough trouble in his life, and I don't want the mother of my children to spend the rest of her life in a supermax prison." Her perfect face lit up. I added, "And I never want us to misunderstand each other. As soon as one of us has a question or problem, we should discuss it and resolve it, no matter how sensitive the issue is. I have a feeling that I would still be married if my ex-wife had told me about her insecurities earlier. Oh yes, by the way, I have no regrets, since I have seriously improved my situation with you." She laughed modestly, and I continued, "But there can be no misunderstandings or secrets in a happy marriage, and I want to make sure that we are always on the same page with each other. So you must agree to bring up any problem you face and make sure we solve it, even if it means digging through the process a little." She nodded eagerly as I said this. I said, "Looks like you have something to say." She said with a huge smile, "Of course, I agree with all of this. But more importantly, when do we move on to consummation of the marriage?" I stood up to face her, and she rushed towards me, one arm wrapped around my neck and the other arm pulling me down into a passionate open kiss. For a moment, I said to myself, "She's only 28, I know. I think too much." Then she moaned loudly. My brain told me, "I heard that same noise in the corridor of the ship," and I had an instant feeling of unreasonable jealousy. Then the rational part of my brain told me to shut up. Her mouth was wide open. She was making passionate little screams, and it was obvious that she wasn't going to let go of my neck anytime soon. So I picked her up Fabian style. It was easy to do, as she was as light as a feather. I carried her across the patio and into our bedroom. All bedrooms faced the sea, along the entire patio area. Our door was open to the ocean breeze, so I carried her to the bed. Meanwhile, she grabbed my neck, kissing me hard. Part of me had to be aware of the navigational issues because she was clearly lost in her passion. My last thought was, if smart girls are passionate, then Chelsea Hughes must be the smartest girl in the world. I carefully removed her hands from my neck and threw her on the bed. She lay there completely helpless. Her delicious little breasts were heaving with passion, and her intelligent green eyes were completely clouded with lust. She was wearing one of her light linen sundresses, which was bunched around her waist, and it was obvious from the twisting of her hips and constant screams that I better get to work, otherwise she will start without me. I was planning something more romantic for our first time together than wild jungle sex. Looking at the magnificent naked beauty lying next to me, I believed her, trusted her, and knew that through her I was going to be reborn, a new man with no regrets. We spent a couple of weeks enjoying the peace and tranquility that only great wealth and luxury can bring. The sex was wild, more like a romance than a married life. We made love like a young couple. Of course, Chelsea really was young, energetic, giving, and tireless. I, not so much. We both accepted that an age difference was inevitable. She had to get used to the fact that I was 47 years old. and I had to get used to the unbridled freedom from complexes that her generation enjoyed. I benefited from her enthusiasm, but I was clearly not as young as before. This didn't bother Chelsea at all. She took greedily, but gave no less. And it was absolutely clear that sex was simply her way of expressing love in physical form, and not an absolute goal in itself. So, if I couldn't make it to the start of the fourth lap, she would just lie there, hugging me with the most aesthetically pleased expression on her face. The fact was that Chelsea was a different person than Heather, much deeper emotionally and simply smarter. Most significantly, although the sex was great, it was secondary. It was simply a byproduct of our incredibly powerful sense of identification with each other and attraction, and in many ways, we were both recreated as a couple by our union. This reconstruction was literal in my case. The records are stored on computers, and someone with Chelsea's skills can make you into anything they want, sometimes even against your wishes. My new incarnation was interesting. I became a millionaire venture capitalist who invested in many humanitarian projects. My extensive social media profile was a masterpiece of deception, as well as the necessary trail of documents. The Red Dragon painted me as she saw me, simple, loving, decent, and honest. But even my ex-wife would not have recognized the active, sophisticated bon vivant that Chelsea created, with a little help from Photoshop. My photos required some changes due to my past life. I've always been the faceless face of the hacker community, but everyone who knew me in my past life still remembers what I look like. So a supposedly dead person who keeps popping up on Facebook might raise questions. I disappeared into the sea. At least that's what the investigative notes Chelsea posted said. I boarded a small fishing boat and went several miles out into the Gulf of Mexico to fish and was never seen again. So Thomas Miller Meissner was duly declared dead. I had decent life insurance, and between paying out my 401k and selling the trailer, both kids turned out okay. It's not their fault that their mother went crazy. I still followed them on social media. We decided to get married in a small ceremony at the estate. Since I was a fictional character and her large extended family would never understand, we decided to keep the event just between us. A judge of the peace and a couple of paid witnesses, one of whom was the ever-present Jean-Claude, were the only participants. Since my personal story was a product of creative writing and not factual reality, we needed some time and space between my full arrival on this earth, the fictional story and all, and the Meet the Parents event. Chelsea was part of a loving family group, and she was their crown jewel. Her sudden and unexpected marriage would raise concerns. These were questions neither of us wanted to face, especially the question of who this dirty old man is. Therefore, for now, we have agreed to keep our marriage a secret, just like the Red Dragon. The wedding night was no more wonderful than any other night. This is because it was impossible to improve upon perfection. I walked out of the bathroom to find my wife lying naked and waiting in all her glorious glory. This caused an instant mental breakdown. It was hard for me to believe that I could be so happy. Heather left me to my own devices, and this wonderful woman revived me to a life of peace, tranquility, and love. It seems impossible odds have come together against our alliance. I was 19 years older than her. I went through the grinder in my first marriage, and the last thing I wanted was to trust one of these liars again. While in her real life, Chelsea was the original fairy tale princess, preppy debutante with stunning looks, a great mind, and the Scarlett O'Hara lifestyle. And of course, much more alarmingly, she was also a sinister global figure, feared by every CEO of every greedy corporation in the world. There was no way that we could be right for each other, but we were getting closer. And we did it on a level of consistency that was so deep and connecting that I just knew we would never be apart in this life. The reason was simple. We both wanted the same thing, to spend my life with the only like-minded person, and we were both committed to this proposal. Chelsea saw and understood our compatibility while turning my life upside down. She was wise far beyond her years, and her decision to be mine happened long before she actually met me. I felt that same sense of agreement almost immediately. This happened even as she maneuvered to get me out of the dark web's clutches, so I couldn't admit it yet. But at least I was smart enough to realize that Chelsea was not Heather, and so I was able to put all my preconceived notions about women aside and start making a commitment in my own mind. I knew I would never regret it. This is because it is the soul, not the packaging. I missed this important point the first time, but my new wife's loving and deeply caring spirit simply spoke to me. As she pulled back the blanket, she said, "Welcome to your life, my love." She then pressed her gorgeous little body against mine. I said with absolute gratitude, "And thank you for giving her to me, my love." Chelsea was sitting at her desk in our office. My wife could be shopping online, or she could be taking down a global corporation given her special skills. You never know what might happen when Chelsea Newhouse sits in front of a computer. Little Brooklyn sat nearby, giggled. Brooklyn is only 5 years old, but I get the impression that her mother is already introducing her to a brave new world. I have never had a hard time accepting the fact that my beautiful little wife can bring absolute hellfire and damnation to anything she chooses or anyone she chooses. I knew going into marriage what she was capable of. But I also knew that Chelsea had the moral integrity of an archangel, in my own way. It just so happens that her views on what is considered proper retribution may be a little Old Testament. She doesn't like bullies or people who take advantage of the helpless. So every now and then she has to release the red dragon to even the odds. This is nothing more than a hobby for her, but it's also the story of my life. Some people's wives win cooking competitions. Mine is a mysterious global superheroine. She is a passionate woman, and I understand her desire to right some really gross injustices. I feel the same way. But while ordinary husbands may hear about injustice and think, "I wish I could do something about that," my wife is one of the few people on Earth who can actually get a little revenge, even if it might accidentally overthrow some third world regime in the process. More importantly, it's not just Chelsea's decision to release the red dragon. We carefully consider the justifications and consequences and consider the benefits together. It may be lynching, but we always act together. This is another example of how close we are to each other. And I have to tell you that I get great personal satisfaction from watching my stunningly beautiful wife cut through the godless with a reliable and fast sword of digital calculation. Overall, I'm a happy and contented person, and Chelsea is the perfect wife, even when she's saving the world. We decided to settle permanently in St. Lucia, so we bought our own complex closer to Donkey Beach. I won't go into detail about how it was paid for. Suffice it to say that we divided the expenses through several numbered accounts. You believe it, right? Enough time passed, and we decided to hold a Meet the Parents event. Sooner or later, this had to happen. But this timeline was radically accelerated by the fact that Chelsea was already 3 months pregnant. I was very nervous. It was obvious that I had robbed the cradle. And standing next to my tiny, already obviously waiting wife, I felt like the most depraved weirdo in the world, especially considering that her mother was only 2 years older than me. Her mom was probably the hottest gilf in the universe, completely different from her daughter. Chelsea is 5'1", small-boned, and has an exquisite figure. Chelsea's mother is only 5 inches, but she has the body that every teenager dreams of. She has a Chelsea hourglass figure. These are much more exaggerated, wide hips, incredibly thin waists, and huge breasts. Plus, her mother exudes sensuality and Chelsea looks cool and intelligent. However, they both share the same boundless intelligence and fortitude, and I also know that they have the same inner fire. Hughes and I have never met, so I wasn't worried about him recognizing me. But at the same time, it was eerie to meet someone from your old life. Both parents were amazingly understanding. They seemed to be experiencing the same thing, meeting and marrying someone who was not a likely partner. We had a story prepared that Chelsea had provided a lot of circumstantial evidence. It was a fairy tale worthy of Cinderella, including charity balls and whirlwind romances in Boston. It would stand up to scrutiny. But this, of course, was complete nonsense. It didn't matter anyway. All Chelsea and her mother, Maddie, could think about was the impending birth of our little girl, which we decided to call Brooklyn. Maddie clearly loved children, so much so that she would probably be happy with my wife being killed by a turkey. As a result, she and Hughes immediately moved into Cap Estates to stay close to their grandson. My impression was that Hughes had little say in the matter. Having a baby was a life-changing event that I felt repaid me for all the suffering I went through at the hands of Heather. And I loved this precious little bundle beyond human logic. She had thick brown hair and all the beauty of Wilson. More importantly, she was my special angel. My life will be dedicated to making her life happy. Looking at the two of them laughing together, my wife and my child, I was overcome by my usual neurotic traits. It was too much happiness. I told myself, things like this don't happen to people like me. Then my rational mind kicked in, and I thought with some irony, the life of every normal person is much longer than he imagines, and in the end, everything can be fixed. So if you stay in the game, make the right decisions, and take action. With their determination, you can change anything. The thing is, all my hopes and expectations didn't disappear when Heather betrayed me. Instead, I found better ones. Admittedly, this required a lot of luck. But I realized what I wanted as soon as Chelsea appeared in my life. More importantly, I acted on this knowledge with purpose. So, if there is a moral to my story, it is this. Your life is shaped by the choices you make, and you have no choice until you die. So, when the right opportunity comes, you need to take advantage of it, and hold on with all your might. This simple little wisdom has become the real foundation of my bright and wonderful new world. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.